Dear Professor Charpentier, dear President Stock, dear Deputy Minister Rimov, dear colleagues, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, once again I would like to welcome you to the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. Our academy is among the founders of ALEA, and ever since its establishment we have been actively participating in the initiatives strengthening scientific cooperation in Europe. The Bulgarian Academy of Sciences welcomes the creation of the consortium under SAPER project and has already expressed its readiness to actively collaborate to the provision of scientific expertise for policy advice. The SAPER project is very important indeed. It responds to the requirements to improve the quality of European Union policy making by providing timely scientific evidence to the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism, thereby increasing the transparency and public confidence of the European Union policy making. Actively bringing the knowledge of academies into the policy making process is thus only a logical development and highlights the importance of academies for the European science landscape. A new model of interaction between science and policy in Europe is increasingly necessary. Scientific opinions on the most serious problems, including on hot topics asked by politicians, is regularly prepared. We have to work towards a change in the policymakers' attitudes for more collaboration with scientists in the policy-making process. Let me just mention that an important forthcoming issue to be addressed is to better shape the framework Program 9, in particular by assuring equal participation of European Union member states in the framework program for science and innovation. I think that we all are convinced completely that supporting talent all over Europe is a vital importance for Europe's future. I very much hope that the exchange of ideas, experience and good practices today will become a solid basis for a more effective partnership between scientists and decision makers. I wish you success of today's meeting.
Dear Professor Rewalski, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to be here today again and to say several words about the advisory mechanism, which is, I guess, extremely important for both sets of politicians and sets of scientists. It's important to be efficient in training politicians, to educating them, and it's also very crucial to be able to do the best which is possible to work together with politicians. Of course, one should take into account that scientists and politicians are solving different optimization problems. So the main goal of us as politicians is to make European citizens and citizens happy in order to be re-elected in 4 years. At the same time, scientists have another agenda. So it will be very good to work together to find a correct measure, correct metrics to do this job. Of course, it's extremely important to be able to predict some hazards, say. You may know that in January 2017, here in this country, in Bulgaria, we had very heavy snowfall. So our scientists, especially from the Academy of Sciences, did a very good job. They used to run the Eulerian model to predict very carefully using the supercomputer Abetuhol, which is installed here in Sofia, with a very fine resolution, just 300 meters, to predict which part of the highway from Sofia to Burgas should be closed. And this just showed how powerful is the scientific advice to politicians. At the same time, of course, we need to look for metrics to measure the happiness of citizens. And I was surprised to learn that there is such a measure. It is some research is done by Raj in his famous book, which appeared just one year ago. So let's work together. Let's try to formulate unified optimization problem, and let's try to help politicians to be more efficient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ruralski, Professor Dimov, for this warm welcome, for hosting us here in Bulgaria, and for being such great hosts, really. My name is Julia Stamm. I have the pleasure of guiding you through the day. I'm a science policy consultant based in Berlin, and I will try to make sure that everything runs smoothly, that our speakers get the attention they deserve, and we also try to make sure not to go over time too much. As you've seen, we have a very, very dense agenda, and so we need to be very strict with time. We also want this discussion to be a very practical one, not too theoretic, and for that we rely very much on your active engagement. So please ask your questions, we will have the microphones in the room, and look forward to exchanging with you. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Charpentier and Professor Dijkstra to join me here on the stage and to provide us with the framework for today's discussion. Allow me to introduce very briefly Professor Charpentier. Professor Charpentier is the chair of CEPIA since December last year, and also president of FEAM, the Federation of the European Academies of Medicine. He is honorary dean of the Faculty of Medicine of Paris Sud 11, and a fellow of the French Academy of Medicine. Bernard, the floor is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the CEPIA conference as part of the ALEA 2018 General Assembly. Our event is entitled Shaping European Science Advice, Insights and Experiences. We are very grateful to the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences for hosting the event today. Thank you, Professor Ruralski, for your hospitality, and ALEA for organizing this assembly. And thanks so much, Professor Ivan Dimov, for this talk about science and education in Bulgaria. Both are the two pillars of a great nation. Throughout this morning, you will hear more about the CEPIA, Science Advice for Policy by European Academies. It has been my pleasure to chair the CEPIA board since the end of 2017, after the mandate of my good friend Günter Stock, which is at the first row. In this exciting project, we bring together the perspectives of more than 100 academies into the European Science Advice Mechanism. CEPIA's creation at the end of 2016 and our ongoing collaboration with the European Commission Group of Chief Scientific Advisors, GCSA, formerly HLG, because I'm old, so I'm just coming back to HLG, are important steps in ensuring transparency in science advice and for science to play a significant role in advising politicians and proposing options for policies. Thank you also to all the people working so hard in CEPIA, in SAM, in GCSA for building up the Europe of science and innovation, sustaining competition with the two giants, US and China. This is the reason why we need the help of every nation of Europe, big or small. There is no big or small science, there is only one good science. In the session that followed, we will explore the scientific advice for policy making with perspectives from different countries. Across Europe and beyond. We will then delve into CEPIA's work so far, using two case studies to explore the opportunities and challenges that emerge from providing scientific advice in this way. Today's conference will then offer an opportunity for academies to reflect on the discussions, providing their valuable insights in the process. The interdisciplinary of SAPIA will be of paramount importance. I would like to offer first some brief thoughts on the three aspects of SAPIA that I personally feel are very important in our success. The first of these is the interdisciplinary. I will provide a few examples of topics of advice that we have worked so far and we have examined. How to systematically gain more food from the oceans. I just recall that in Europe we have 6 seas, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, US only 2, and China 1. How plant protection products should be regulated, the latest thinking of cybersecurity, the climate change mitigation potential of carbon capture technologies. For all those topics, and indeed for all policy topics, the questions cannot be answered with the knowledge of just one discipline. By combining knowledge from engineering, mathematics, philosophy, humanities, medicine, natural sciences, and social sciences academies, SAPIA takes an interdisciplinary approach to these topics. You can see on the screen behind me, it's maybe impossible to show you the slide, but how SAPIA is formed to a consortium of European academies networks that cover this wide range of disciplines. I think this interdisciplinary is very important in our approach. The combination of different disciplines will also be essential in our next major topics, transforming the future aging. Europe is the oldest continent compared to Asia, Africa, South America, but aging doesn't mean inertia or idiocy. I would like to highlight geographical spread. Later this morning, we will hear about the advice systems in different parts of Europe, in South Africa. We will see that advice is developed and taken up differently by different countries. The need for a broad range of geographical perspectives is represented within SAPIA itself. It is also represented in our group of experts. SAPIA is also aiming for geographical spread when we disseminate our findings. We have been working with academies to develop public engagement events, and we have so far showcased our work in UK, Norway, Germany, Estonia, Slovenia, and the Netherlands, with events to follow soon in Portugal, Romania, and Sweden. How there will be scope to work with academies further in our public engagement activities over the coming years. And finally, but very importantly, I would like to highlight the need for SAPIA collaboration with all the scientific community within the network's member academies, with stakeholders for each topic and the group of chief scientific advisors. This has been essential for the process of providing scientific advice to the Commission and has ensured our success so far. I look forward to this continued warm and very positive collaboration. It's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Per Dysart, my own Per, who will explain more about the work and formation of the group of chief scientific advisors. I might just say that they regain now the Holy Kabbalistic number 7 in the Bible, because Nicole Robert from Oxford University, and starting from Ulm, and who is a very kind expert, will work with us, was recently nominated. I look forward to the interesting discussion that will follow, and I thank everyone for attending today. Thank you so much indeed for your attention. And I am sorry for the slide, it's a technical failure, the digital world.
Thanks very much, Bernard, and also for coping with the technology issues. It's always a surprise when things don't work the way they should. Bernard, from your talk, I already take away a number of things, among others. So I would like to retain your idea that there is no big or small science, but only one science. I also take away the notion of the importance of interdisciplinarity for all policy topics. And finally, also the need for science to reach out and to engage with stakeholders, with others. And I think these are 3 topics that will probably accompany us during the day. I'd now like to introduce very briefly Professor Pearl Dijkstra. Pearl is the Deputy Chair of the European Commission's Group of Chief Scientific Advisors. She has a chair in empirical sociology and is a director of research of the Department of Public Administration and Sociology at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. And her work mainly focuses on intergenerational solidarity, family change in aging societies. So Pearl, the floor is yours. And this time technology is with us.
Good morning, Deputy Minister. Good morning, President of the Bulgarian Academy. Good morning to all of you. It's a privilege to be here to introduce SAM. Yes, in Brussels one loves acronyms. SAM is the Scientific Advice Mechanism. And Bernard, fortunately I do have slides because what I have has not been written out. But I can complement what you had to say. The Scientific Advice Mechanism was established in the fall of 2015, and it's an umbrella. It's an umbrella which includes SAPEA, Scientific Advice for Policy by the European Academies, it's a wonderful collaboration because this way we as chief scientific advisors can rely on the best knowledge in Europe, all over Europe and all disciplines. And I would also like to acknowledge that there's a scientific secretariat in Brussels, a group of about 20 excellent academics, some of them are full professors, led by Johannes Klumpers, who's here in the first row and who will be speaking to us later. Who are we? Well, yes, as Bernard said, we are now 7. And please look, you will see that we're now 4 women and 3 men. Look also that when I started, I was the only social scientist, but now there are 2 scientists, social scientists. I will take you through the pictures and the names. From the top left, he was nominated by the Young Academy, so that's wonderful too, that we're not just a set of gerontocracies, but we also represent the young of the academies in Europe. Janusz Bujnicki, Polish, and he's a biologist, a bioinformatician at the University of Warsaw. Then the second from the right is Elvira Fortunato. She's a materials engineer, and she's at the University of Lisbon. Then, top right is our new star, Professor Nicole Grobert, German, English, and she's at the University of Oxford, a specialist in nanotechnology. Bottom left is Rolf Hoyer, particles physicist and former director of CERN, and he's the chair of us 7 chief scientific advisors. In the middle is, at the bottom, is Karina Keskitalo. She's a political scientist specializing on environmental issues. She's at the University of Umeå in Sweden. And at the bottom right is Paul Nurse, a biologist, director of the Francis Crick Institute in London, and as you all know, a Nobel Prize winner. It's very important for our status, not only in Brussels, but all over Europe and the rest of the world, that we show that we are not only the best of science, but that we are characterized by integrity. Yesterday, José van Dijk described the principles that contribute to trust in science, independence, transparency, autonomy. And so if there's any conflict of interest between our positions and what we are working on, we are open about it. We're also fully open about what evidence we have used. So people who visit our website can see what topics we're working on, how we're working on them, what publications we have used, and the kinds of evidence, and what we've learned throughout the process is evidence is not necessarily always already published. Some of our topics are so new that we rely on expert advice, which we gain through workshops. On the one hand, we are responsive to requests from the European Commission. And here are examples of 6 opinions, that's what we call them, scientific opinions, which we have delivered to the European Commission. One is on CO2 emissions, the difference between what was happening in the laboratory and what was happening on the road. Report on cybersecurity, report or a scientific opinion on, this was what we called an explanatory note, because what we used here was to provide the state of art of science, and this was on new breeding techniques. The report, Food from the Oceans, the scientific opinion, will return in a later session. As we speak, the scientific opinion on plant production products is at the printer, so that will be coming out in early June. And in preparation is another scientific opinion, which came from our very first one, and that's novel carbon capture and utilization technologies. I can assure you that our work has been making an impact, and that is one of the tasks that the Secretariat has taken upon itself, to trace where our work is being used, in what regulation, and whether it's in Europe, the national level, or the local levels. We are also proactive. We're developing our own topics. Bernard, this is a topic developed by where SAPE is taking the initiative on the future of aging societies. Another topic which is of great interest to the policymakers is, the working title is Making Sense of Science Under Conditions of Complexity and Uncertainty. And here we hope to end up with a scientific opinion that will help policymakers understand or make sense of the complexities that science has. When science disagrees, when science has evolved so that earlier views have changed, or when science runs into problems of poor replicability or biases. These are problems which are almost inherent to the scientific process, but can be very confusing not only to citizens but to policymakers, and we are going to try to help them through these issues. So, what's the bigger picture? There's the 7 of us. We provide scientific advice to the European Commission. The European Commission uses it in its regulation. Those regulations are discussed in the European Parliament. Their regulations are discussed but also adopted at the national level. And in the end, and this is something that one of the speakers said, our goal is to make a better society for our European citizens. Thank you.
So also a big thanks to you also for your last words on what science is actually supposed to do, and to me in particular in the context of sun. I take away again the notion of interdisciplinarity, also the composition of your group of advisors, and the importance of scientific integrity, transparency and ethics. And before moving on to the next speaker, I would like to give you a quote by Rex Tillerson. You might remember, former US Secretary of State, and he said yesterday that the American democracy was threatened by a growing crisis of ethics and integrity. And I'm reading this out because I think it's interesting in the context of our discussion today. And so he said, if our leaders seek to conceal the truth, or we as people become accepting of alternative realities that are no longer grounded in facts, then we as citizens are on a pathway to relinquishing our freedom. And I think this is very interesting in the context of our discussion, in the context of how to provide actually science advice to policymakers. Maybe you can reflect on this in the course of today. I now like to invite Karina Andrzejeva to join me here on the stage. She will be our opening presenter. She will give the keynote for today on how to develop scientific-based policies, future policies for sustainability and growth based on research data and analysis. And Karina, if you allow me, I'll just introduce you very quickly. So you are the Counselor and Head of the Sector Education and Research at the Permanent Representation of Bulgaria through the European Union. Europe, if I may say so, has been a key issue for her since her studies in European integration and contemporary history here in Sofia. Karina is also a founder of the Club of Young Scientists in Bulgaria and has for 10 years coordinated the network for national contact points for the European Framework Programme. Karina will speak for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. We will not allow any questions after her presentation, but she will join the panel after that, so you can grill her later on. Please, Karina.
Thank you. Registered rules. This is how we like it. Good morning, honorable guests. Good morning, the president of the both academies, dear colleagues and friends. I'm also using this expression because I was working at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences for around 3 years, and this was extremely enriching period of my professional development. Moreover, I'm very excited today because for the first time I was speaking here on this stage, I think in 2001, when most of my friends nowadays from the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences was wondering what exactly I can say from the point of view that I was just graduated. But anyhow, some years later, I'm here today again, and I'm really very much honored to open this first session and to talk about evidence-based policy. This is an extremely important topic again nowadays, but it is not new. This is what I want to stress. In fact, there are many developments on the European level and concerning the developments that the new Commission, especially investing in the SUN mechanism, but we also should remember that already in 2011 we had the Chief Scientific Advisor to the President of the Commission, which really showcased and gave a strong signal to all the Member States that we have to invest more efforts in policy based on strong scientific evidence. There are, of course, many aspects that you touch upon today. I wanted to make it simple and exactly to talk about what is the role of the academies, what is the role of the national academies and the FALEA, and what is the potential for their growing interference in the whole cycle of evidence-based policy making. In principle, it's not an easy or there is no one model that can be applied, but for sure there are several aspects that it would be nice to discuss today. One of them is that we need, and I agree with previous speakers before me, that we also need to make the policy more efficient and the politicians more efficient. But in fact, what we very often see nowadays is that there is a constant pressure on the researchers to try to reach or to find the politicians, to persuade them that they are doing something right or wrong, or they can do something better. Very often we are in a position, meaning from the point of view of the researchers, to try to find open doors so that our voice is heard. And I believe that this is not the way of how we are going to do efficient policy making. In fact, there should be another model where the politicians make their decisions or take important decisions before that they consult researchers. There already we see very good instruments like SAN mechanism, which can be replicated to national level. But what is the problem, in fact, to realize this, if it's so easy just to call politicians, advise before that scientists, and then everything is fine? Of course, it's not so simple. Of course, there is first competition among researchers. Secondly, in order these mechanisms to work, we need really a quality and excellent science, so that the politicians can also more persuasively make their decisions. On the other hand, it's not so easy because we have to understand the politicians. Very often they don't react or they don't take decisions because of evidence or because they did a very thoughtful impact assessment. Very often they take decisions in a political manner, they take emotional decisions, they take decisions because there is a demand from society on something important also, of course, for the policy cycle. The other problem with the politicians and the researchers is that, in fact, the research, and I think this is the core and the most important, what we have always to remind the politicians, the research per se is the knowledge base of the whole society. And we can't expect the research to work in a policy cycle as the politicians for 3-4 years to produce something that is used and then is not anyone. But the politicians, they work in a policy cycle. They're in a hurry and they want to show results. This is the other problem, in fact. My deputy minister today showcased some positive examples and for evidence policy making for decisions where politicians need the science results. But these are very often emergency situations with a high sensitivity for the society, where of course the politicians then need the researchers in order to prove their decisions, or how to say, to explain a problem, which is very often of course linked to the security of the citizens or environmental issues. So in my perspective, also working in the council, where we are supposed to advise our politicians to take decisions for the development of science, I believe that we also need to create better networks so that our own capacity is enriched on every daily basis with scientific evidence. Because more and more what we are working, and this is another aspect I wanted to touch upon today, is quite much interdisciplinary. We know this, of course, but we need somehow to combine knowledge more and more from different sectors. And when we are talking for policy and politicians, this morning I was thinking, yes, but in fact policy and politicians can't work without governments, without administration. So this is another point which I don't know if you discussed that you develop something to SAPEA, but I think this is a very fruitful area when we can cooperate more. Because in fact the administration stays, the administration, the bodies stays after the policy cycles. And more we see that we have a lack of expertise, a lack of knowledge, concrete knowledge in different administrations. So that to fit different policies from agriculture and energy to cybersecurity or defense. We now don't discuss which thought was this to inject into the administration young graduates who graduated political sciences, but never touch upon or get acquainted with important topics, for example, concerning genomics or other areas. So I believe that a huge role of the academies, and especially of the national academies, and there are already a very good examples in this area, is the education. We can't educate the politicians, but we have to educate, and we can train the young generation of researchers and the young generation of administration and politicians. But I don't want to simplify it so much. In fact, I wanted to share with you that this is a lifelong learning process. And in fact, the demand for the knowledge which the researchers are producing is growing, because in fact the environment is becoming more complicated, and people can't that are working in specific industries, in specific politics, they need urgently this knowledge. And here is, of course, one aspect that I'm very happy to share also with you today, that during the Bulgarian presidencies we worked a lot on it, and we can congratulate with the good results, as on 29th of May we expect the ministers to adopt a council conclusions on circulation of knowledge transfer. One of the main aspects we touch upon at the Council, and we developed specific recommendations to the Member States, is the access to research results. We discuss a lot before we start this presidency of the Council of the European Union with our researchers. We make analysis also on national level, but also we discuss with other Member States. And in fact, we discovered that we have fantastic research results funded through the framework program or funded through the national funds, but we don't have the necessary access to these research results that are already there from years, which also can enrich the knowledge not only of the politicians. And here's another aspect. I don't want to repeat what the honorable guests before me said, but we won't succeed in this exercise if, of course, the stakeholders, the civil society, but also the industries also are not acquainted and get more understanding of how should work and how we should plan our work, our jobs and our policies ahead. I recently was in the European Parliament in a debate where I have to share with you that there were fantastic young Bulgarians with some very successful companies that are now selling for thousands of money, and this is what very often we want from research. Okay, why you're not developing immediately startups, why you don't turn your results into a growing demand and knowledge and jobs. Wonderful of these young people. I afterwards asked them, are you cooperating with research, or what did you graduate, what are your next steps? The answer of one of these young men was, well, I should need. I was so clever to invent this that now I have some next ideas. And I said, wow, this is very interesting. How you get the data for these ideas? How then you scale up your business? Who will give you the data, for example, that we are gathering in different areas? You should contact the university, or you should contact the Academy of Sciences. And I didn't thought about this because we have Google, no? No, I said, but anyhow, I see, and I don't want to stop your dreams, but okay, I'm showing this because very often we have failures of also of the young generation of innovators, because they are also not acquainted, they are not diving deep into the knowledge which they need constantly in order to develop their businesses. The same we were discussing today for the policymakers. But I don't want, of course, to praise only the, how to say, my friends from the research sectors, and to say that they are doing only excellent, they shouldn't do anything, and the others should understand them. I mean, at the end of the day, we also should recognize that the researchers have also the responsibility, of course, to share what they are doing. I mean, if they expect that their research per se have to be understood, and have to be taken on board, of course, this is not how exactly is working. And this is another pressure for the researchers, and especially from the managers of the research institutions nowadays, because the demand for communicating skills, the demand for open access to the research work, to research data also is growing, which demands different skills, different combination of infrastructure, of environment, and last but not least, of course, it demands a lot of time to be realized. These things don't happen from one year to another. But I believe that this is the way forward, and indeed, as representative of Bulgaria at the Council, I can't say anything bad but good for what is happening on the European level. We have the SUN mechanism, which can be really boost ahead. We also have the Joint Research Center. But more is necessary, because we shouldn't go on like this, dragging science desperately to be heard from the politicians or to be used. It should be equal level, so to speak. And I'm positive that this will happen with people and with the knowledge we already have in the academies. Thank you. So I wish also fruitful discussions today, and thank you very much once again for the invitation.
Karina, thanks very much, and as I promised, she will join our panel. Also in your talk, Karina, you have already made a number of very, very interesting and inspiring statements. Just want to remind you of very few of them. So there is the importance to understand the context in which policies are being made, like policy cycle versus the science cycle. The importance of collaboration, and collaboration was highlighted not only between disciplines, but also between different sectors, between different administrations, but also with civil society and industry. You also mentioned the importance of education of scientists, of the next generation of scientists. And you also highlighted the relevance of understanding, trying to understand each other, and I find this notion of understanding to be a crucial one. And finally, you pointed out the aspect of time, and that we shouldn't rush things and expect things to happen within the next minute or so, and we need a long breath for things to really work in the way we want. Okay, I'd now like to invite my first panel, Professor Peter Halligan, Professor Franz Broms, and Dr. Sia Vuia-Bulani, and you see I don't manage, I'm very sorry, so I just call you Sia, he has allowed me to do that. Okay. So, Peter, Franz, and Sia, please join me here. Our first panel will be dealing with a national, or several national perspectives on science and policy, and we have our eminent speakers who will do this from different perspectives. They will give a short input of 8 to 10 minutes maximum, and then we'll open for the discussion with you. I would like to start by introducing Professor Peter Halligan. He is the third Chief Scientific Advisor for Wales, a position he took up very recently in March 2018. Prior to this, he was the Chief Executive of the Learned Society of Wales. Before that, until 2014, he was Chair and Academic Lead of the Welsh Crucible, a flagship leadership program for early career researchers, and we might come back to the notion of education here. His research background is in neuropsychology, neuropsychiatry, and neurorehabilitation, and the title of his talk today will be Science Advice for Government Policy, a Rough Guide. The floor is yours, Peter.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to present at this conference today. What I'm going to tell you about very briefly today, as the remit, the exam question that Julia set us, was basically look at those aspects of science-based policy in different contexts, and I'm going to talk from different perspectives, particularly with regard to the UK. I'm also going to offer some practical suggestions from some of the initial thoughts I have from colleagues who are already working in these positions within the United Kingdom. The first slide I have up here, just to remind people where Wales is located on the left-hand side. But back in 2004, in the Eurostat yearbook, they unfortunately seem to have neglected us somewhat. Anyway, a small country, but at the same time, definitely on the map. So, multiple perspectives. Basically, as Julia pointed out, the last time I presented here was in 2016. Very briefly, when we joined, the Learned Society of Wales joined the ALIA family, and I've been in that position as Chief Executive for about 3 years. And in that capacity, like other national academies, we were providing a source of independent authoritative scholarly advice to government and other sources on matters that affected Wales. It's a very relatively new society. following on in the steps of much more prestigious and older societies. But in March of this year, I moved across into the position working for Welsh Government as Chief Scientific Advisor. And the remit of that is to provide and review scientific advice provided to government, to work with the UK Chief Scientific Advisors Group, and to champion the role of science, and to provide independent advice, scrutiny and challenge to the Welsh Government. So in my brief discussion this morning, I'm going to cover 4 points: science advice to government, science for policy and policy for science, influencing policy, some little insights that I have with regard to my experience in Wales, and some practical observations derived from other colleagues on the basis of their experience. So, in terms of looking at the ecosystem that's out there with regard to science advice, there are different models reflecting different political cultures. The one I'm familiar with for the most part is the one on the left-hand side. And it goes back to 1957, I think, when there was a first US presidential science advisor, followed several years later in the United Kingdom. But it's true of other countries like Australia, India, Ireland, and so forth. A variety of those particular countries have chief scientific advisors which report to government. The second structure is the advisory councils. And the chief scientific advisors often utilise science advisory councils, and these again are one step further independent with regard to the relationship with government. Thirdly, we have the various national academies, which in the United Kingdom are very strong in promoting science and bringing issues to bear with regard to government. The 4 national UK societies, Royal Society of British Academy, Royal Academy of Engineering, Academy of Medical Sciences are very established, but also, as are the ones in Scotland now, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and more recently the Learned Society of Wales. And then we have a 4th component, the supernatural, Sakya, which we've heard about, which is a very interesting alternative model with regard to providing science advice. The UK government one, which I sit within to some extent, the government chief scientific advisor sits at the centre of this and reports directly to the Prime Minister. The chief scientific advisor is supported by a large group of Go Science, which is about 90 individuals, which provide a lot of the background support with regard to that individual. But that individual also has a dotted line to government departments. And in the United Kingdom government, there are about 20 different departments of which feed into the GCSA. But in terms of the structure, if you're starting from the left-hand side, moves from the government chief scientific advisor to the departmental chief scientific advisors, to the devolved nations as well, to the government science and engineering members, which are basically within the civil service, to the science advisory council and various committees, and then into a variety of outside bodies, including the national academies. The UK has a whole variety of chief scientific advisors in these different departments covering health, the Ministry of Defence, Environment, and the Foreign Commonwealth Office and Security. And we meet on a regular basis. The advice that has been given to me in my early stages with regard to learning about this role is that the Government Office for Science really only get involved when the outcomes at stake must be quite large, that science must be a significant factor in contributing and determining the outcomes, and if it can be done by someone else or some better qualified groupings, it should be. So in practical terms, and that was one of the remits of this session this morning, it's in practical terms, they prioritise in terms of its important novelty, the urgency, the timing aspect as we've already heard, and the longer-term implications for science in relation to policy. Science for policy and policy for science, it's often the case that in some CSA systems the advisors combine the responsibility to use the scientific evidence in policy making with a role in determining the budgets and the structure of research. In the UK, these roles, for the most part, are distinct, largely to avoid being seen primarily as an advocate for resources for science. Having said that, it's hugely important that the science advisors are involved in supporting the capacity for science. Otherwise, it will undermine the contribution to economic and societal impact that it is to be derived there. In Wales, let me give you some little practical examples of my own. So, the first chief scientific advisor, John Harries, began his work. He was started in 2010. In 2012, he developed a Welsh Government vision to build a strong and dynamic science base that supports the economic and national development of Wales. And the great thing that John secured for Wales, and this is more under the Maple Policy for Science, was the idea of an initiative called Sir Cymru, Star Wales, which was based on the idea that they secured money from government to set up 5 international chair appointments and a whole host of funding for postdoctoral researchers and PhD students. And this was spread across the whole geography of Wales. Later on, the second chief scientific advisor, Julie Williams, was to some extent influenced by work that I did myself when I was in the Learned Society of Wales. I published a report that argued for the case that Wales needed more research capacity in the area of STEM. And that particular report was taken on board and actually resulted in the securing of about 65 million by the Welsh Government to develop Sir Cymru 2, which brought in about 130 different researchers from all parts of the world, including some of these countries here, including Bulgaria. The other aspect that when I was Chief Executive of the Learned Society, again working across the idea of how one can perhaps influence, is the idea of putting together documents of a nature that actually would persuade government to both use and take heed of. And we did a variety of these, including one in science back in 2016, but also the latter one on the right-hand side, Wales in the World, was a document we put together, which again now the Welsh Government use on trade missions and so forth. It's an opportunity to combine and convene the actual intellectual vitality of Wales in a way that the Welsh Government could actually make use of that. So, some practical observations on science advice that I've derived from colleagues for the most part, because it's still early days in terms of my role. Some advice will be ignored. After all, it's only advice. Expect to inform policy, but not make it. CSAs do not make decisions. It's much better, as Peter Luckman argues, to act as a broker, not an advocate, and this derives the earning of trust we talked about yesterday. It's important to maintain scientific credibility with politicians and scientists, and it's also, as we pointed out yesterday, you can't resolve value conflicts through appeal to facts alone. Effective advice increasingly relies on interdisciplinary expertise, and that's been resonated in the earlier presentations this morning, and particularly the contribution, I would argue, with regard to social scientists. It's often the case that most of the debates about scientific advice focus on the supply side, but the demand side is equally important. All advisory bodies need a realistic understanding of how policy-making processes work in government and the pressures and constraints under which politicians, their officials and decisions, and their special advisors operate. From the demand side, these are a couple of observations that one's gleaned. Policymakers seem to have, or would be described at least, maybe from a science point of view, have limited bandwidth and often limited manoeuvrability depending on previous policies and the electoral cycle. The policy cycle is generally short. The most relevant science that on specific issues is often incomplete and sometimes ambiguous. Policymakers cannot be expected to be scientific referees. Policymakers see scientific evidence as one of a number of inputs. From CSA experiences of colleagues in the United Kingdom, the three main things that they suggest to me that might be worth highlighting is the fact of different lenses, the approaches that different groupings, scientists and politicians and those in charge of delivering have to consider. The importance of effective communication was substantially highlighted. And then the idea of helping policymakers to solve problems, because after all, that's one of the reasons why the question was posed in the first place. So, again, reiterating that scientific advice is just one part of the picture, and you can provide the best evidence, but the different lenses at work there with regard to the individuals who are requesting that information have to be considered. Finally, we must recognize that science advice is itself a field of academic study, a growing field, generating its own theories and conceptual models to explain complex relationships. And it's one of those sort of fields that I think will mature over time, so that maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, with all the different insights. Thank you very much.
Okay, yes, thanks very much. A big thanks to you, Peter, for your thoughts on how one has to approach the issue of science advice to policy in a very practical manner. I take away, as before, a number of issues. You talked about the timing and the urgency that need to be taken into consideration. You spoke about the importance of capacity building, both within science, but also in terms of scientific capacity on certain issues, which is also a very crucial issue. You said that one has to take into consideration the supply and also the demand side for science advice. And this is not trivial either. And you said that maybe scientists who want to provide science advice should consider themselves more like knowledge brokers and not have this idea of being able to make policy, but only to influence them, to be realistic in what they actually can achieve. And I'm sure we will take up a number of those issues later on in the discussion. Now I would like to hand over to Frans, Professor Frans Bloem, who is the Council Secretary and Director of the Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy. He's also a Professor of Normativity of Scientific Policy Advice at Utrecht University. And Frans, you have a background in ethics and philosophy, and you have chaired since 2016 the Netherlands Society for Bioethics. And the title of your talk today is Science-Based Policy Advice Needs to Take the Policy Perspective Serious. We're curious. Thanks very much.
Good morning, everybody. The Scientific Council for Government Policy in the Netherlands exists since 1972. And this council does not advise the government, the current government, but it advises on government policy, which includes, in a country where you have coalition governments, also the next government, the opposition and parliament, because you don't know who will be governing next. And since you don't know who will be governing next, it's important for science advice from our council to be linked to the broadness of policy making. And this broadness implies that we're not the science advisor of the current government. Our council exists of 8 council members, including a chair, and together they divide 3 full-time positions in time. So they really work as a council member. They are supported by a secretariat which has 18 researchers, 18 full-time job equivalents of researcher, and then some secretaries and communication staff. This together is the council, and I emphasize the word together because in the world outside of the council, both staff members and council members are seen as representatives of our council. The council is built up, exists of people with different scientific backgrounds. And when I use the word science, I use it in the translation of the Netherlands and German, Wissenschaft, which is broader than the natural sciences. We have lawyers, social scientists, economists, medical doctors, policy study people, philosophers, among our staff and in our council. For us, it's important to start where the audience is. that is to start with the policy issues and to learn that different policy issues ask for different kind of science advice. For example, a lot of policy decisions have their own supportive regulatory science mechanisms. Take a decision whether or not to allow a new medicine. It's regulated. There are scientific advisory mechanisms helping to take those decisions. They are not work for us. The same holds with plant protection, water management, energy, etc. There is a lot of normal policy making in which a lot of factual knowledge about the world is necessary, for which governments, at least our government, has different systems to work. Our task is to look at long-term strategic issues, issues that are not to be solved tomorrow, or maybe they should be solved tomorrow, but we know they can't be solved tomorrow, and that are for a long time on the policy agenda. In that perspective, policy making is not only short-term, there is a lot of long-term policy making going on. And we look at those long-term issues in order to advise. I'll give an example of a recent report we published. We published a report on the non-cognitive aspects of human agency. In this report, we analyzed the current state of affairs in psychology, in decision-making, theory, etc., to see that in order to persevere in decision-making, much more is necessary than knowledge. You have to make a plan. You have to work when things go wrong. You have to get out your bed every morning, etc. Open your post and all those things. All actions that are not necessarily steered by knowledge. And we learned that those abilities are not equally distributed among citizens. Some people have a lot of action power, while others are limited in their action power. And we learned that it's not distributed among the same lines as intelligence. You have very smart people with little action power and the other way around. And we learned that action power changes when, for instance, there is stress, an important life event or something like that. It diminishes. And finally we learned it cannot really be trained. You see, a lot when people come in financial problems, we can train a little bit on doing their finance, but we can't train the whole possibility to open an action thing. This created, when we were not careful, a very negative message for government. Our government has a policy of getting more responsibility to citizens, and we tell them they can't take it and you can't learn them to do so. That wouldn't work quite well. So we try to think, what can government do? Which is a very important part of science advice. Not just telling, well, this is the problem and this we know, but think along their lines what to do. And we learned that a lot of decisions can be made accordingly. We gave a few practical examples, and I'll give one here. Make sure that if you change things and give responsibility to the citizens, that they are not worse off if they do nothing. I take the pension planning as an example. We have a national big pension planning system, and one of the things many people say, people should have more say about it themselves. And we say that might be from a political or political theoretical perspective interesting, from a political ideology maybe even necessary, but be aware that many people are not able to take those responsibility for such a long-term decision. Even if they can understand, They are not having the willpower and the possibilities to act upon it. The costs for tomorrow are much more urgent than the long-term benefits they can't see today. So take that as a point of departure. We were able to make this report with a lot of different specific examples where things go wrong and things could be better. What we did, we provided government with an action perspective, which is quite important. This leads to my concluding remarks. The interdisciplinary in this study was fostered by the problem, not from the science perspective. Looking at the problem brought which disciplines were relevant, not starting with the scientific perspectives. Problems aren't disciplinary structured. The quality of our report was not just the scientific quality. Of course, no real involved scientist should be able to criticize the fundamentals of the report, so we had peer reviews and everything. But it's also about advisory quality. How do we advise in a way that they can do? The independence, it's much more than formal transparency. It's also with which stakeholders we were involved and with whom we spoke in order to get a broader picture of the problem. This issue is an example on the agenda setting. We brought it on our agenda ourselves because we thought for a long-term perspective for government this is important. We get topics asked by government, but for us it's very important that there is a mechanism that goes beyond the daily routine of policy making to open up for strategic questions. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Frans. If you allow me, I will also try to just highlight some of the things that you've just said. So you said when we want to think about interdisciplinarity, we have to think about the problems and not about starting from a science perspective, which I think is a crucial insight. You also said just when you want to identify topics, you have to go beyond the daily routine and be open for strategic issues. Look for the real issues, also with help of stakeholders. But again, when you're thinking about stakeholders, you also have to contextualize this engagement of the stakeholders. And you mentioned the notion of independence as a central notion for science advice, and that it's much bigger than what we usually understand when we talk about independence. Thanks. Now, our last speaker for this panel, Dr. Bolani, if I may introduce you as well. So, Sia is the Senior Liaison Officer at the Academy of Science of South Africa, where he is in charge of the Academy's Overseas Collaboration Sub-Program. His role there is to build new and maintain existing overseas partnerships. He previously served as researcher at the South African Council for Scientific and Industry Research, and he holds a PhD in biotechnology. And your title, Sia, is South Africa's Science Advice Landscape, the perspective of your academy.
Thank you very much, Julia, for that warm introduction. And let me start by saying good morning to everyone and thank the organizers of this conference for the invitation to participate in this panel discussion on science for policy, national perspectives. As Julia has mentioned, I will share a little bit about South Africa's science advice landscape and give you sort of what we do, sort of practical example as an academy. But when I listened to a lot of speakers yesterday, today, we sort of saying more or less the same message. But I'll try to use more examples to indicate what our role as an academy in South Africa. So in August 2014, Sir Peter Globman, Chief Scientific Advisor to the Prime Minister of New Zealand, jointly with the International Council for Science, which is ICSU, hosted and chaired a conference on science advice to governments. one of the outcomes of this meeting was a decision to further develop the international network for science advice to governments. This conference was followed by a series of international agreements that have science at their core. In March 2015, world leaders agreed on the Sendai Framework for Disaster Reduction for 2015 to 2030. In September 2015, the United Nations launched a set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals with targets for achieving by 2030. And the so-called COP21 meeting in Paris in 2015, world leaders agreed on a deal to rein in carbon emissions to tackle climate change. So the fundamental question has always been how do governments, UN bodies, and other players integrate the best science into their implementation plans to achieve one or the other of the SDGs or targets set by the Sendai Paris agreements. I'm sure that many of the academy secretariats, former presidents of academies and current presidents that are present here today can remember that ASAF, the Academy of Science of South Africa, jointly with the IAP, hosted a conference on science advice in February 2016 in South Africa. The conference explored a wide variety of themes under science advice, such as country readiness for science advice and the interplay between science advice, politics, and media, to name but few. The conference was preceded by a workshop on science advice itself that was designed specifically for academics and policymakers from Africa. It was at this workshop that INGSA Africa was established with the intention to do the following: create a platform for connecting advisors with policymakers, encourage sharing of knowledge and learning, and establish common principle of developing and reporting science advice to African governments. The African Network has become an essential tool to fast-track training of scientists in a continent where science advice is very low. A desktop study that was initiated by the South African Department of Science and Technology that analyzed 19 countries in Africa, including South Africa, showed that 53% of the countries had individuals trained in SDI policy analysis and formulation, whereas 47 had no information at all. When asked if their ministries have adequately trained individuals in SDI policy analysis and formulation, 10% had adequately trained, 16% inadequately trained, and 74% had no trained individuals at all, indicating that this is not in the top agenda of many African countries. When asked what are the specific skills or development priorities for their country or ministry, 26% had priorities and 74% had no priorities at all, but just indicated that they needed to build more capacity. So the Academy of Science of South Africa, like many organizations in South Africa that are established through an act of parliament, forms part of an advisory structure that include advisory councils, advisory committees, science advisors to ministers, presidential agencies, sector-specific advisory bodies, regulatory bodies, and early warning advisory bodies. These are quite important, as in the country we have so many challenges. I mean, one of the recent challenges I can mention was an outbreak of listeria, where over 100 people died because of this listeria outbreak. And some of these bodies were quite essential in terms of their response and advising the Ministry of Department of Health as to how to deal with the issue of listeria. Over and above that, when one remembers of a recent incident of the death of over 100 mental health patients in South Africa because of simple neglect, And some of these things are things that departments can easily address. But without the engagement of civil society, it becomes very difficult. But civil society comes into play in advising government and taking government into task in terms of how they should undertake its duties. ASAF's science advisory role in support of policy development is informed by key national challenges, particularly those outlined in the country's national development plan. The Academy's strength lies in undertaking in-depth, evidence-based studies. As part of its contribution to the National Development Plan, the Academy has undertaken studies that went to inform policy in South Africa. Some of these studies include the PhD study. It's called the PhD study, an evidence-based study on how to meet demands for high-level skills in an emerging economy. The recommendation of this study now underpin South Africa's policy on how the country should address challenges of producing more PhD graduates. More recently, the South African Department of Science and Technology commissioned the Academy to undertake a study on South Africa's technical readiness to support the shale gas. The study was undertaken following intense debates in the country by many stakeholders, including business, academics, policymakers, and civil society. Some of the studies have fast-tracked response from government ministries by increasing research funding and infrastructure development. But there has been challenges when conducting joint studies with other African academies where the topic under study is outlawed in a particular country. A study on diversity in human sexuality, implications for policy in Africa, is one of such example. The study, which was jointly done with the Ugandan National Academy of Sciences, could not be launched in Uganda, although the Academy had endorsed the study. This was due to the country's Anti-Homosexuality Act. It is safe to say that ASAF has enjoyed a somewhat positive response from the South African Department of Science and Technology in using some of the Academy's studies to inform policy. This could be as a result of the Academy's proactive approach in undertaking some of the studies that align with the country's national development plan. In addition, the independence of the Academy and the quality of its work has given it respect from many of its stakeholders. With all I have mentioned, the need for science in government remains underestimated, particularly when making economic, environmental, social, resource management decisions, especially in health, education, justice, and industrial sectors. Of course, science is not the only source of knowledge. I think that has been hammered over and over in this conference. Knowledge comes from many different sources, such as religion, dogma, and family tradition. And when this is related to science, it becomes very complicated. A bigger issue in the understanding of how politicians see something and how different scientists see the same issue. Science has many processes, and it is the processes, not the facts, that give science the privilege over any other sources of knowledge in advising government. Policy is better if it is informed by evidence and not determined by evidence. Policy is made by politicians and policymakers, and it includes other considerations such as public opinion, political ideology, and democracy by electoral contracts. I would like to conclude by saying there is a tendency to only look at natural sciences to provide input for science advice, while other areas of research are equally important. If science advice is informed by diverse sources of information, then it can respond in diverse solutions to both systematic and sector-specific challenges. The interaction between science and policy ultimately depends on trust. Without trust, science will have no impact on policy. That is why the integrity of everyone involved in this process is critical. Thank you very much.
Big thanks to you, CEO, also for helping us to step beyond the European framework to learn about how things work in other areas of the world. As for the previous speakers, if you allow me, I'd like to highlight some of the things that you have just said. So you pointed out the importance of understanding and being open to other sources of science advice and other sources of knowledge. And you said that if science advice is informed by diverse sources of knowledge, it's even richer and can be more effective. You also highlighted something that was already stated earlier, that policy should be informed but not determined by evidence. And I found also that this was a good formulation. You highlighted the importance of capacity building in several respects. And at the very end, you came up with the importance of trust, which is also a crucial notion in the context of the things that we are discussing today. So now I would like to open the discussion, but maybe you allow me, the speakers, to ask a first question, and that links immediately to what you just said, namely trust. So how does one generate trust? How can science advisors generate the trust of policymakers to listen to what they have to say? Maybe you would like to reflect on this. Who would like to go first? Yeah?
Thank you very much. This is a very important question of trust. I mean, one of the things I would like to indicate is that actually when one looks at even how academies state, say they provide evidence-based science advice instead of providing informed science advice, that I might say is something that generally policymakers do not like. They feel that it is arrogant to take an approach that advice only comes from science without considering other aspects of other areas. Now, trust is an important issue, especially when this arrogance from scientists comes into play, when they feel strongly that what they have to say is the only way to go. So how do you go about ensuring that this trust is established? One of the ways that we have gone about at the Academy is to basically center our studies around, as I've indicated, around what the country's priorities are. And of course, some of these things, we're not doing it just for, for reaction from the government and all of that, but sort of look at long-term, studies that will provide some value for the country. But while we do that, we engage government officials, policymakers, quite very early in some of our discussion, so they understand what we're doing and the reasons behind what we're doing. Of course, without trying to influence what we're doing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a slightly different opinion, but here I'll take the opportunity to complement what you said, because the trust is also relevant to politicians. Who trust them in the end of the day after the elections. So I believe that also it's different cultural mentalities, because we are talking for arrogance that we very often see, and we discuss this in fact in Brussels. But when I come back home, I think that in fact we need, and the researchers need to be more self-confident, because I'm working with a lot of young people, with pupils, and I have to tell you that they definitely trust, because they just are still innocent, so to speak, and they really trust and they really praise what researchers are doing. opposite to politicians, opposite to journalists, they are very open to learn more. But again, at the end of the day, how we are building trust nowadays, we are losing trust in research. That's true, because just the dynamism in the world is different. The digitalization, the openness of the world, the fake news, especially the mass media, led to very variable aspects of understanding researchers. So I think, again, our responsibility of managers and researchers themselves is constantly to inform, to share what they are doing, not to become politicians, not to advise, you should do this or that. This is not the role of the researchers, but they should constantly inform and share what they are doing, and make the citizens, as you said, and the politicians make their informed choice. And the trust will come more and more. I think overall we trust in science because we love science.
I think looking at trust is looking from the wrong perspective. If I ask you, do you trust me? Trust is gone, because trust is a kind of tacit demand that's in between a relation before we thematize it. I think we should focus on trustworthiness. If we say there is not enough trust, we say the others don't trust science, it's their problem. If we say we need to work on the trustworthiness of science, it's our problem, and that's something we can do about. And if we do something about trustworthiness, I think there are two elements really relevant. One is the element of ability. One trusts someone who is able to do something. We're very good and we're hard working on that issue, and I think rightly so. But there's a second issue, and that's the issue of relevance. You trust someone who is not only able, but is doing the things you would like that are be done, who shares the values that are behind it. That's, I think, why the colleague from South Africa rightly said we work on societal important issues. Are we, when we work on the problems, really looking at the problems as they are posed, and are we serving those who have to solve these problems? If we can show that we make a difference, that we help them, that would be a part of our trustworthiness.
Thanks. Yeah, I just compliment some of the other points made by other speakers. I think the importance of solving a problem, I mean, that's in some respects where the genesis of some of the requests come from, and the ability to do that in an informed way without accepting, or by accepting the fact that the decisions that are made by politicians are separate from the advice that's given. I think another aspect with regard to trust and trustworthiness is the idea of building a relationship. These people are in government for reasons that they're trying to do good for their society, and from that point of view, understanding them as people and developing a relationship where that trust and trustworthiness can be exercised, I think is a very practical aspect.
Thanks very much to the four speakers. Now it's time for questions from the floor. Please, if you have a question, yes, just come to the microphone and ask our speaker.
We have seen the last 2 years a dramatic shift in attitude in the United States at the highest political level towards science. The Trump administration shows a profound disrespect for facts, for knowledge, and for science, and they base their decisions certainly on other criteria. So my question to the panel is, do you think there is a risk that this will spill over also to Europe? Or do you think that European countries has the strength to continue and develop a knowledge-based policy?
Thank you. Who would like to take this question?
The risk of spillover is absolutely there. And I think we need to be aware of that risk. That's first. I agree. I think one of the issues, as far as I can see, is that science in the United States, in their political system, has been linked much more than here in Europe to one of the two political parties. From many research we see that it's not just a Trump administration problem, it's a long-term problem where science, scientists, academia has lost its link with the Republican Party. If that goes on a long time, I think that's a big problem. So I think we need, beyond the analysis of the facts in the decisions, also a good analysis of the life views, perspectives, and the role of facts in those with regard to the different political parties. And we need to link broader than just to the progressive half of Europe.
Peter?
Thanks. I think there's very much a threat of spillover, and I think we can't be complacent about it. But one of the things I was interested in is the Ipsos Mori poll that was mentioned yesterday. If one looks at it in terms of trust in various professions, and we took some solace with regard to scientists and professors being up there, along with nurses and doctors. But if one looks at a granular level, in fact, and breaks the data down in terms of those who have degrees and those who have no higher level sort of education, you can actually see there's a considerable drop-off in that. So it's a reminder to us all that when we're looking at some of these issues, we can't afford to be complacent with the idea of the pervasive nature of populism.
So yeah, how do you see this discussion from South Africa?
Thank you. Although I'm not from Europe, but of course I can take this question. What the question raised is very important, but I mean the beauty about this is that science is quite universal. If Trump's attitude affected the decision making that the academies in the US were taking, then there would be even greater concern. But I think what's important here is that despite the attitude of the Trump's administration, what is important is that it moves the world into a different dimension, which is science diplomacy, which is very important, and it's sort of a buzzword in our days to engage on issues of science diplomacy. And I think this is that a time where science diplomacy takes a center stage.
Thank you. I was looking. Thank you very much for the question, provocative questions. It's good, especially in the morning, to wake us up a little bit. I was looking for the tweet of the President of the Council of the European Union of yesterday. Maybe it can answer a little bit. Looking at the latest decisions of the Trump administration, someone could even think, with friends like this, who needs enemies? But frankly, you should be grateful. Thanks to him, we got rid of all illusions. We realize that if you need a helping hand, you will find it in the end of your arm. I just wanted to share this with you because rarely I like some tweets of politicians. But what I can comment on this, and it's very serious, we are very often recently hearing also explanations very often from the Commission analysis when we are trying to make a good decisions, analysis based on comparison with the states, how they're doing good, where they're doing. I think we are a little bit suffering of this self-confidence, and very often we are then asking why we should always compare only one side, only one element. For example, the investments or the innovation boost. We should compare overall the science environment, and Europe can provide a lot to the world, and especially to the science diplomacy, because we have a lot of added value there. And maybe in the long term, in fact, it will happen, I hope so, that our approach to science and innovation was with a more impactful and added value. So maybe we can now try to learn our friends from the States how to do.
Thank you. I see 1, 2 more questions, 3 more questions. So I suggest, for the sake of time, that we ask the 3 of you to come to the microphone, ask your questions, and I'll ask the panelists to take all questions together. And maybe you briefly introduce yourself, very briefly.
Olivier Pironneau from Academy of Science in France. When you advise your government, do you try to see forecast the kind of bad things that would happen after you do your advising? Because you know that you represent one consensus, but not all consensus, and you have some people who are very different opinions and sometimes unfounded. So do you try to see what's going to happen if with the consensus that you propose?
So a similarly related question. My name is Marion Scott and I'm from the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So Peter mentioned that you can't resolve value conflicts through appeals to facts alone. And yesterday some of the presentations focused on reaching consensus. And in a European context we've seen examples where, if you like, decisions and views concerning, for example, neonicotinoids and pesticides have been quite different in different parts of the European Union. So how do we resolve, if not with facts, the value conflicts? How do we strive towards consensus in our, if you like, advice to policymakers?
Was there a third question? No. So who would like to go first on the implications and how to resolve value conflicts?
Yeah, that's a very important question. One of the things that I think is very useful is the convening of the multiple disciplines. We've heard about interdisciplinarity, and I do think that the different processes and skill base that different disciplines bring provide for both the awareness of the fact that some of the solutions are beyond the derived information, but in terms of realizing there's a variety of different constituents that have to be brought together. I'm not sure that necessarily always seeks to resolve, because beliefs are very powerful and they often determine the scaffolding of our frameworks for understanding. And from that point of view, it's not always the case that the consensual aspect will actually result in some sort of final agreement. But I think one of the aspects that brings some benefit to that is the interdisciplinary approach, and bringing in particularly some of the nuances of social and cognitive neuroscience.
I'm not sure whether consensus is always something we want. Some problems are complicated in a way that advising government would already be very helpful if we map out who has which opinion and why. This implies not only the natural science analysis of the facts and the perspectives, but also the social and historical perspectives on where the problem comes from. I'll give an example, genetically modification and food. If we want to understand the discussion about GMO food, we need to understand the role of food in different cultures. In some cultures it's just to nourish yourself. In other cultures, the whole identity of the culture is embedded in the food. And changing that food from that perspective with a technology that's foreign says it is going to change the building blocks of life, etc., links to different value perspectives and different feelings to those who are involved, and therefore will change the different scientific perspectives of the issue. And if we do not recognize those aspects of policy problems, we will be limiting ourselves to a small technical issue that's maybe not the issue at stake for the policymaker.
Thank you. I think this brings me to something that I said in my keynote, that these are elements that we should work more, because I think the models in different, I was thinking countries, but you're correctly right that it's about more cultures or whatever communities, it's different. And I don't have one answer. I think the most challenging for the academies, because we don't have in Bulgaria scientific advice mechanism, but the government very often and currently establish a very cooperative model of call on the academies. So, but it's a little bit straightforward. We ask the Academy of Sciences, the president of the BAS can say more, or we ask the Academy of the Agrarian Academy on particular issues. And then yes, you are asking yourself how you can reach a consensus. Then if you advise more or different research communities, then it's very difficult. So my prescription for this is that the academies should collaborate more among themselves. They should be more open, and a kind of a model of peers, or as the other speaker said, interdisciplinarity approach should be more embedded, but also somehow external support, or open to other models in other countries. And yes, last but not least, we anyhow need, from the perspective of the academies of sciences, to think more about some kind of ex ante when we are providing this type of opinions, because very often they are very strong, they are sound, the politicians take them, but then some years later it's difficult to explain this, and it has to be always sound. Once a politician steps on this, I believe that when the next political party comes back to this, it has to be sound, it has to be there. This is very important, and this is why we're talking about excellence in research.
Thank you very much. Maybe picking up from your very last point of politicians, just to add, that remains a big issue when you have a change of government, where at times that when there's a study that has been proven to be important for the country, and you change the guard, whether it's the minister or the president, it loses focus, and whoever comes in that position sort of try to find their own thing to do. But of course in Africa we've got different sort of challenges. I was talking to Professor, I think, Owen yesterday, just indicating to her that one of our challenges is career politicians, people who have been in the system for just way too long. I'm not even talking about the president, I'm talking about the ministers that move from one ministry to the other, and some of these people become hardened. So whatever advice you provide, they simply don't care, they just move on to the next ministry. So that's another dimension to this entire topic about consensus. It can be very difficult.
Okay, with this, I suggest we close our first panel. I'd like to thank my speakers very, very much for a lot of inspiring thoughts that will accompany us during the rest of the meeting. You are now cordially invited to refresh yourself, get some coffee, and we will then be back here at 11, and aim to resume at like at latest 10 to 11. So again, thanks very much. Okay, I hope you all have had your coffee and tea and are now ready for the next couple of sessions. I think we had a great start this morning. I will take this opportunity to alert you to the overview of publications of the Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy that France was representing here. So you find this leaflet out at the reception, out there at the reception, but he's also happy to send it to you and additional information if you'd like. So just get in touch with France. We will immediately move on to our next session after having heard from people who are in national contexts, mainly providing science advice to governments. We will now talk about very, very practical examples. So this session is entitled Scientific Policy, Advice and Practice, Success Stories, Challenges, Impact and Limits. And the first case study that we will be dealing with now is called Food from the Oceans, and you will learn all about it in the next 45 minutes or so. We have two very interesting speakers here on the panel that I'll introduce in a second. They all have the challenging tasks of limiting themselves to 5 to 7 minutes max, which I'm sure they'll manage, in order to have a little bit of time for the discussion as well. We will start with Professor Ole Petersen. Ole is the Vice President of Academia Europaea and also Director of the Academia Europaea Cardiff University Knowledge Hub. He has held many posts in academic societies and funding bodies. For instance, he was Secretary General of the International Union of Physiological Sciences. He is a Professor of Physiology at Cardiff University in Wales. And what I liked, I choose this from your bio, he was appointed in 2008 Commander of the British Empire for Services to Science. I think Ole is a great person to have with us here today. And the title of Ole's talk is How to Get It Right from the Start. Ole, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Julia, for this introduction. So we are talking here in this session about one particular topic, namely food from the oceans. I'm not a fisheries expert, I should say immediately, so I am not an expert in this area at all. But this question came from Commissioner Vella, Commissioner for Maritime Affairs, and the question was how to potentially extract more food, more biomass from the oceans in a sustainable manner. And I will not talk much about the actual report, because as I say, I'm not an expert, but more about the mechanism by which we reached the production of what we call an evidence review report. This was actually evidence review report number 1 from SAPER, so it was in that sense a little bit of a pioneering task. So many people actually delivered on time, and was actually a very substantial report. It was 160 pages long, and given that this was carried out essentially most of the work in a 6 months period, I think it proved that it is possible for academies actually to be effective, because that had been one of the sort of major doubts, I think, in the minds of many policymakers. Okay, academies may be composed of eminent people, etc., but they take their time and probably they can't deliver on time. So at least the process was efficient. Now, when I chose the title, How to Get It Right from the Beginning, it is because I think the experience here showed how crucially important it is for the initial scoping review to be very thorough. And so some of us were a bit concerned that it took a little while before we had totally formulated things and totally decided on all the different elements that had to be conducted. But actually it proved in the long term to be a very, very important step forward. So one of the best, I think, advices initially to get it right is make sure that you know exactly what it is you are talking about and exactly what you're going to do, and also exactly what you're not going to do, so that you have really a confined time. The next question is, of course, to get the right experts together. In this particular case, SAPER decided that the lead academy for this was Academia Europaea, and this is how I came into this process of being responsible from SAPER for guiding this process through. So, having decided on what we wanted to do and what we did not want to do, we knew the kind of experts we were looking for. That we had a great convening power, so we issued invitations for nominations, actually were signed by the SAPER president Günter Stock, and this made clearly a good impression in the community, because we had a massive number of nominations, no less than 100. So lots of people actually from the academies were keen to participate, and they nominated not only members of the academy, because in this particular area there were actually not masses of members in the academy in that area. So many members of the academy knew about other people who actually were real experts in this field. And so the difficulty was then to select. We did that very quickly by a telephone conference call. And out of these 154, we then finally turned it down to less than 20. 2 different working groups were put forward, because in this particular case, it was clear that there was a need for the natural science expertise in the marine biology, obviously, but there was also a need for the social sciences to play an important role, because if you propose changes in the pattern of food consumption and so on, you also have to think about all the economic consequences of this and whether the public will actually want to do that. So these working groups were fairly quickly established, started to work. There was a great coordination between the 2 working group chairs. And most importantly, we had a very effective administration out on this, namely in the hands of Louise Edwards, who is the manager of the hub in Cardiff that Julia just mentioned, who drove the process relentlessly and made sure that everybody was on time. And this is an important process. So I won't talk much about the recommendations themselves, because as I say, we are not in a fisheries discussion here, and I think Ian will say probably quite a bit more about that. Now, in addition to getting it right from the beginning, there's another element that I just want to touch on very quickly in these few minutes that I have been allowed to do, and that is outreach. It is a part of the important contract between the European Commission and SAPER that in addition to producing the evidence review report, we also need to have outreach. We need to tell people in the communities about it. And we have had a lot of these activities in different countries. And they divide basically into 2 different groups. On the one hand, one would like to have a big audience, and we had major presence at an international food festival, for example, in Cardiff. Very large numbers of people knew a bit about what happened. However, if you had done an examination afterwards of whether these people really had learned a lot, it probably wouldn't be all that much. But they had some awareness was there. In contrast, at the Hamburg Academy, we had a much more confined session where about 100 people came to a quite detailed evening session, and we had scientific presentations, and there was a very good discussion with the public. So this was a smaller number of people, but these people probably had actually learned quite a bit about it. And so we have to be careful again when we evaluate outreach activities, how we deal with this. On the one hand, it looks impressive if you have large numbers, and there's a good point about that. On the other hand, we also have to think about how do we actually evaluate whether these outreach activities are actually effective. And in the UK, where we have a research excellence framework where we evaluate also impact, non-academic impact, we are looking not just at the number of people who are present at a particular event, but also at whether it changed perceptions, changed knowledge about things. And I think that's very important. And finally, I just want to sort of make a more general observation, because we have been talking so much during both yesterday and today about trust in science. And I think there's been one thing that really has been missing. I made a short allusion to that in an intervention yesterday. The most important thing about trust is actually past success. We trust science because it has actually given enormously fantastic results over many, many, many years. And that's the real reason for it. It's not that we are nice, that we can speak in nice language to other people or something like that. The trust is based on actual results, something that works. And I think that's just as well to remember that. And those academies that are respected are those academies that have a long track record of actually electing people who have changed the world and have actually made something happen. And I think it's very important that we keep that perspective in straight. The problem here is, of course, that the timeline can be very long between scientific discoveries and actual results. But ultimately, we only respect those who create something that actually works. And I think I am hopefully within my time, and I will stop here.
You are just perfect, Ola. Thanks very much. Okay, Ola, you have reassured us in your talk that academies can indeed be fast, which I think is a wonderful statement in the context of our discussion today. You have also alerted us to the importance of thinking about ways to evaluate the effectiveness of knowledge, and to think about impact, but also in different dimensions. You again brought up the notion of interdisciplinarity, and that we need the perspectives of all sciences to look at issues, also if you want to have impact. And then you also reassured us or reminded us of the fact that trust is not something that is very short term, and it's actually something that is earned and that is based on actual results and a very, very long history of doing science. Good. We will take these issues up in the discussion, I'm sure. I would now like to invite Pearl. I don't introduce you again, Pearl. I'll just give the title of your talk. So Pearl will be speaking on Food from the Ocean, Scientific Opinion, a broad and deep range of potential policy actions. Pearl, please.
As is the case with Ola Peterson, who's not an expert on food from the oceans, I'm not an expert on food from the oceans, although I have become a little bit of an expert, and in fact, enough of an expert to present our work, our recommendations in the European Parliament, and even respond, I think rather adequately, to questions of the parliamentarians, which is interesting because our scientific opinion is for the Commission, but this topic has been picked up by a large number of legislators. What's nice about this session, and I'm sure the session following it at this conference, is that we're not just talking about doing science advice, or talking about it, or actually doing it. So that's what I'm going to be that's what I'm going to be talking about as well. This was the first time that the group of chief scientific advisors worked with SAPEA and were very, very, very happy with the collaboration. I want to say that Karina Casquetalo was the person who was primarily responsible for the work on the food from the ocean. So I'm just a deputy. And I want to acknowledge her wonderful contribution. SAPEA wrote the evidence review. So that is, what does science know? What does science not know? And it was done, as Ola said, in a very short period of time. And I talked to many of the scientists involved in the report, and they were saying, we were under so much pressure, but they did it. And we were surprised and we were very gratified to see their willingness to work with SAPEA, to work with us. And one of the issues that arose is, well, what do they get back? Yes, we're working on, or SAPEA is working on ways to remunerate them, but we can't, I mean, they're not getting a publication out of it. They can put on their CV, yes, they contributed to an evidence review, and which served as the basis for scientific opinion. And what we subsequently did is that our chair, Rolf Hoyer, sent a letter to the university or the institute where the scientists were employed, also sent it to the scientists themselves and said, we want to thank you for allowing your scientists, or we want to thank you, individual scientists, for working with us. We can't give much, but it's a way to acknowledge the important contribution that they made. I want to make 3 points that we learned in our work on food from the oceans. And that is that this opinion, and again, we're talking about the evidence review, but then after the evidence review, what was done is we had to make a landscape of the policy. And believe me, there's an awful lot of fisheries and marine ocean policies at all kinds of levels. But we need to know this landscape to know what kind of recommendations might be most effective. So the evidence review was mostly the state of art of the science, But in addition to that, there was a review of the policy landscape where the JRCs, the Joint Research Centers, turned out to be very helpful, and also the policy scientists with whom we were working. But what we found is that concrete and actionable science-based recommendations, and some were very broad. That's the long-term perspective that Franz Blum was referring to. And some were very specific, but that both can be provided in responding to a very general and open question. And Ola told us what that open question was. That is, how to obtain more food from the oceans without compromising their value for future generations. So what were the specific guidelines? Include Maori culture, so that's food from the oceans. Don't forget, Europe is a lot about agriculture. And it's a lot about fisheries, but somehow Maori culture, so harvesting and culturing food from the oceans doesn't fit into the picture. But how suggestion would be to give Maori culture in what has to happen by 2020 is that each country in the EU has to develop a national marine spatial plan. And these spatial plans, of course, it's a lot of competition about land or about waters very close to land. So here you get the competition between the fisheries, between leisure, between the food culture. But these countries have to develop some kind of a compromise when they're developing their national marine spatial plans. So we gave the recommendation, and of course we'll have to see how easy they are to implement. And then we had broader recommendations, like putting in place a concerted mariculture developing policy framework on integrating fisheries and mariculture and agriculture into a cross-policy food systems approach. And of course, that's much more difficult to implement. And it'll also require some breaking down of very typical silos, the silos between agriculture and fisheries and between food. And so we're saying, but this is a very cross-cutting issue. Policymakers, you might need to step out of your comfort zone or your vested interests and look at food from the oceans as part of a larger food systems framework. And the running debate on the post-2020 policy and budgetary priorities of the EU at the highest level provided a propitious moment for ambitious evidence-based ideas. So the timing of the opinion is essential. That's my first point. The second, and this is a point that's also been alluded to by Peter Halligan and by Siyavuya Bulani, is the combination of the natural sciences and the social sciences. And it was crucial, a crucial basis for the recommendations in our opinion. Neither body of evidence on its own was sufficient. The compelling figures on the biological potential for increased food harvesting by themselves would have failed to deliver plausible and actionable recommendations to a situation where the social science literature was unanimous in pointing to governance failures as the single biggest barrier to increases in ocean food harvesting. And this was a point that was also made by Karina Angelieva when she talked about the need to include administration or issues around administration and regulation in providing scientific advice. And the social sciences literature is adamant that regulation questions, whether they're about culture or capture, are key to releasing growth potential. And here it's important to address the complexities of balancing pure economic efficiency considerations with social, cultural, and sustainability concerns. And the social sciences literature also underscores the determinant role of consumer preferences as a market pull enabler in developed and developing economies. Educating people for, might be a value-laden term, smart eating. Moving away from meat and think of all of the resources that are required for the production of 1 kilo of meat protein versus the fewer resources that are required to harvest protein from the oceans. My third and final point concerns the multi-level relevance of the recommendations. As I said, the primary receiver of our opinion was the College of European Commissioners. But as work progressed, and it took us somewhat by surprise, it became clear that the recommendations would implicate policy actors at all levels of governance, down to, yes, local community level, especially those concerning mariculture, given the locus of competences and the way in which subsidiarity applies in this domain. And this has become even more tangible since the opinion was published, with scrutiny and debate of the opinion undertaken by the European Parliament, the Committee of the Regions, member states, and indeed many concerned private stakeholders at both European and national levels. You will not believe the number of invitations we received as chief scientific advisors to speak, for example, in the Basque region or in Cyprus, and so forth, and so forth. This fact, so the multi-level governance fact, puts the closeness of the date for the publication of the post-2020 EU budgetary priority proposals, makes it tantalizingly interesting for us, 5 months after we delivered the opinion, to see where and in what way across the different levels our advice is being acted upon. Maybe one of you or one of the speakers, and I'm turning to Ian, of course, is aware of other such impacts that might have escaped our attention. But one of the things we are doing, and the Secretariat is doing, is seeing where our recommendations are being referred to in the development of specific policy recommendations and legislation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Provost, for being so focused and for giving us very, very practical things to think about when it comes to providing science advice to policy. You reminded us of the fact that we should not be, in this on all levels, afraid to break down silos, that this is actually a precondition, and that we have to step out of our comfort zone, and this goes for policymakers as well as for scientists. You also spoke of an issue that did not yet come up today, but this is crucial. Basically, the reward systems for scientists, they are not being rewarded for doing science advice, for engaging in activities around science advice to policy. So this is an aspect that one has to think about. How can this be acknowledged? How can they not be punished for spending time on writing this kind of reports and not writing the next scientific paper? It's not a trivial issue. You also said that it's very important to understand the actual landscape where the advice will be operating in, and that there are a lot of different layers to think about and to consider. You reminded us again, and I like this, so I can't hear this often enough, of the importance to integrate the different sciences into the work. And you also spoke about the finding or the insight that you gained, in that you actually discovered that there are a number of different layers of recipients for this advice, and that it's very important to think about them and then to also address them and interact with them. Yes, I think I'll stop here. There are many more, but I don't want to take Ian's time. So Ian is one of the recipients, I would say. So he represents the European Commission. He's working in the Directorate General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries, where he's a senior expert. Ian is a physics graduate, and Ian has worked with the European Commission since 1980, mainly on scientific support for EU policy. And Ian's current work aims to help the EU realize the potential of the blue economy. And Ian will focus on important issues for bureaucrats.
Yes, thank you for the previous speakers. I think you set the scene very well. I'd like to maybe, this exercise was so successful, I'd like to see how we could even extend it in the future by explaining a little bit some practical case studies of how we needed scientific advice and how we got it, and it might surprise you. So I want to talk 3 issues: marine litter, Fukushima, and food from the oceans. So let's start with marine litter. This is a real case study. 1st of December 2017, we were asked to propose a legislative proposal for single-use plastics and fishing gear, so as to reduce the amount of plastics in the ocean. And it had to be ready by the 5th of March 2018. So this is trying to take advantage of the huge public concern about plastics in the ocean and trying to get it, a legislative proposal into the works before the Parliament changes. So as part of the work, we requested support from Deloitte and signed a contract with them in December, and they helped. So we have to present these proposals to our impact assessment, to what we call a regulatory scrutiny board. And this is a really tough process. You have to really make a case for why you want to make the proposal. So you have 2 months to make this case. And so it's pretty difficult because you look at all the different measures of how much plastic's going in. Scientists all know about uncertainty, but bureaucrats don't really. We like to have one figure, you know. So if you look at different models of microplastic, of what goes into the rivers, they're vastly different. And that's just one publication. Other publications give other numbers. So you can't do a mass balance, but you want to know what's going in. So in order to know what the impact of your measures are. So in the end, we assumed that what goes in from fishing gear is 20% of what's bought annually. So that was our assumption. But how do we choose our framework contractors? Well, most of the contracts in this case for impact assessments go to these framework contractors, who are basically a set of consultancies, to Deloitte, Pricewaterhouse, etc., who are specialised in, very good in writing proposals. And in fact, it's the selection proposal. It's important that you know that the selection is a bit different from research projects. They only have to be good enough. They only have to have 5 years experience in offering advice in the Commission or 5 years knowledge of fisheries issues, and most of them have, so it's quite easy. And the award is only a price in quality, so in fact we didn't use much of their advice anyway, and so this is how a lot of advice is given to us on matters that are quite scientific. The next question we were asked was on the 11th of March 2011, there was a tsunami which caused a massive release of radioactivity into the Pacific. And we were asked, is it safe to import fish from the Pacific? And of course this is quite important and quite urgent because, of course, there's a lot of fishing industries in the Pacific whose livelihoods depend on it. And there's huge consumer fear about this radioactivity. And if you make a mistake, if some radioactive material gets into the food chain, it could ruin the market for fish for a long time. So this was there were a lot of questions we had to answer very, very quickly in a month. What are the concentrations in the water? What are the concentrations in the fish? Sediment. Does radioactivity accumulate or decay in the fish? What are migration movements? And are the isotopes soluble? And how does water in the Pacific circulate? And no one expert can give you all this information. You have to go round everybody and ask and telephone. And of course it's Easter and everybody's on holiday. So this is a typical type issue that we have. And in fact, after a while you start to understand the problem. You understand that the actual radioactivity in fish doesn't accumulate, but it diffuses out, and there's a diffusion coefficient and a half-life dependent on the difference in concentration in the fish and in the water. But you have to it takes a while, and then you're looking at, do tuna move into the contaminated zone and then move out and can be caught elsewhere? It was difficult. So, but I think Nature wrote something about this that was that was exactly my experience. That the Japanese authorities released a lot of data, but it was in PDF files that you had to try to convert back into Excel. But when the Japanese PDF, Excel seems to be different. And a lot of time was wasted in this, and it was difficult to communicate with the Japanese authorities because we had to go through several layers of administration. But if the data were more available in a rapidly consumable format, then it would have been much easier to get this big community, worldwide community, working on the problem, because you've got and they'd probably be more agile than us, and we could get them geeks, hackers, university students. It was an interesting problem, and they could have all helped, but the lack of data wasn't, not the lack of willingness, but the lack of suitable data was a difficulty. Then the food from the ocean, the good example. So this was fantastic. So the question we asked was, why, our commissioner asked, Commissioner Vella, 50% of the primary production in the ocean provides only 2% of human calories. How do we get more out of the oceans? And this was also, apart from the practical question of feeding the expanding populations, it's helping to get scientists out of their mood that the oceans are there as a wilderness. The oceans are also, they're obsessed with acidification, sea level rise, but it's also an opportunity. We want to look at the opportunities there. And I'll go back, but anyway, the timescale was as Pearl described. It was very fast and very good. I just had a slide, but I don't know how to go back. But the impact, well, it's a bit like what Zhou Enlai said about what was the impact of the French Revolution. You know, he said it in 1970 or something. He said it's a bit early to tell. It has actually framed the support for the aquaculture supporting the Commission proposal for the post-2020 EMFF. So it has actually succeeded in that. And it has brought more coherence between Commission departments in food security policy, if this works. So, for instance, this is the Agriculture Commissioner, and when our commissioner and Commissioner Moedas, who's the research commissioner, circulated this advice amongst the Commission College, he replied that it clearly identifies the potential, and the benefits are evident in terms of circularity and reduction of nutrients. So it's what Pearl was speaking about. It's trying to get us out of our silos, to get the maritime policy, the fisheries policy, more into all the other policies, so that we're acting together. And I think it has succeeded, and it's going to have an even more impact in the future. It was a really interesting piece of work, very high quality, and this is how science for policy should work. And so lessons learned, it was a transparent process. The speed is essential, and like for the first one, open data can help. And for our regulatory scrutiny board, they like numbers, but you have to be able to somehow look at how uncertainty comes into it. And I understand you're going to look at this particular issue in specific, and that's scientists understand uncertainty, but us bureaucrats don't. It's a difficult concept for us. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian, for giving us this very practical perspective, also from your daily work point of view. I think it was very helpful to remind us how advice is being given in practice in the Commission, also how policy decisions are being taken. Found this example of the statistics of untraceable origins interesting. Also the time issue, and we said, well, sometimes we need to get advice very quickly, and we need to reach someone over Easter. It's simply impossible, so how can we deal with this? And the point that you mentioned again at the very end of your talk, namely the difficulty of communicating and dealing with uncertainty, which of course is a very tricky issue in the context of our discussion today. I would now like to open the discussion immediately and to give you the opportunity to ask questions to our panelists on the study on food from the oceans, but also in general. So really whatever is on your mind, and please raise your hand if you have questions, and then again move to the microphone, present yourself very briefly and ask your question. Okay, Professor Stock, please.
I'm impressed by the openness Ian showed, especially with the plastic in oceans, where you had Deloitte in the game. And you mentioned that you did not use too much of this advice anyhow. I don't ask for the reasons, but I would like to ask my fellow colleagues within SAPIA, if we would be asked to make rapid advice in terms of those topics, because Deloitte has to go to our scientists anyhow. They cannot create their own data in this short period of time. Would we have to think about a new financial structure? What is given to SAPIA because Deloitte got money, and they paid money for the people who helped them out. And the question is there a structural need to rethink rapid advice, also in terms of money? And therefore I would like to ask the question if there is a quality issue, yes or no, not in detail, but how we would think in SAPIA about carefully looking about the issue of rapid advice, especially when it comes to new contract. I think that is fantastic that you were so open. Thank you.
Yeah. Pearl raised, of course, this issue about rewards, and I think it's a very important one. At the moment, we are in a curious situation where scientists are paid for advice from certain European organizations and not from other ones. If you are an ERC panel member, you are paid. But if you are a member of a SAPIA working group, you're not paid. And okay, there's a nice letter coming from somewhere, but it probably doesn't cut a lot of ice with the vice chancellors of different universities who are basically interested in sort of more concrete measures. So I think with Food from the Oceans, we were very lucky. As I said, we had a fantastic response. There was probably a kind of enthusiasm for a new process, I suspect. And for that reason, a lot of people were willing to be there. I think in the long term, there is a need actually for doing something, because you cannot have an ecosystem where in some cases substantial amounts of money are paid and in other parts they are not paid. And so I think for the European Commission there has to be some kind of thinking about looking at the overall picture of what scientists are asked to do and what kind of reward they have. And we all appreciate a nice acknowledgement letter, but as I say, at the end of the day, that is not what makes people decide whether to do something or not do something.
This is the rapid. The issue is the rapid response, and yes, you are drawing a parallel with serving on grant panels, but that's when we know in advance which scientists will be doing it. But I'm sure there's a way around it with, I don't know, per diems or some kind of remuneration. Nevertheless, what I experienced is that scientists are willing to contribute because there's a willingness to serve the greater good. So I think people shouldn't be asked to be doing too much in their free time. We all know we scientists do a lot in our own free time. Do we have free time? I don't even know. But I wouldn't want to emphasize the financial too much. I don't want to disregard it either, but what a point I want to make is that there's an enormous reservoir of very sharp minds out there who are willing to help. And don't forget that we as university administrators, and now I'm talking as also a research director, are working towards developing new guidelines, evaluation criteria. And there's this terrible word, it sounds like as if it's English, but it isn't. It's the word valorization. And yes, there's pressure on scientists to valorize their research activities in terms of getting a patent or starting a business. But this is a different form of valorization, and that is, it's sort of like teaching, and in this case, it's helping science. So I think we should also turn to the universities, and we as academies can do that and say, hey, we might do a better job as universities of including these kinds of, again, that awful word valorization, but these kinds of activities in the way we evaluate the progress and the quality of our scientific staff.
Yes, I think, to be fair to Deloitte, we didn't give them very much time, but a lot of the, also when they have a contract, they've won the contract on the basis that they can do anything, so that's why we can give them a contract quickly. So we don't have to write a call for tender for the particular task that they're given. But it took them some time to understand the problem. That was the difficulty. And in the end, we spent most of the time telling them what the problem was, rather than... And then the reports often explain why it's important, but without giving you the answer as to what to do. But I think there is an opportunity for the scientists to organize themselves to be able to support the policy process. And people do want to help society. It is, scientists like to feel that their work is useful. So it's a bit of a bureaucratic organizational problem, and maybe Johannes could think of some way of fixing it.
Okay, we have Johannes, France, and there was another question. Okay, we'll take those 3 questions, and I'm afraid we have to move over to the next panel.
Thank you very much. I actually don't ask a question. I would just like to say to Ule and Günther that I think what you raised is very important, and I am absolutely interested to share my thoughts, and even though they are not maybe certainly fully developed with you on this, because I think it is an important issue that you raised there. So I am supportive of thinking that through, of how one can advance in that area of rapid advice, and also as regards the award question.
My question is with regard to the report and the trust issue. Ola said trust is built on past performance. But if we take agriculture as an example, is the past performance cheap food for many people or intensive farming and factory farms? And that links into the report on the mariculture. Did you look at the issues with regard to pollution, with regard to keeping nature, those issues that are beyond the use of the oceans as productivity source?
That is, we didn't go into detail, but that is how that's where this idea of more food from the oceans comes from. And if you take agriculture as you describe it yourself, think of how much water, think of the pesticides, think of how much land space goes into the production of different kinds of food. And if you take those numbers and compare them with the relative, the more sustainable way in which food from the oceans can be harvested, either by capture or most strongly by culture, that's exactly the point we made. We have to start thinking about mariculture, but it doesn't. Most people think food is agriculture, and one of the points, and that's a point that reverberated very well, and it's not rocket science, but it's, hey, don't forget mariculture. The word mariculture, I don't even know if it it was aquaculture, and that's the sweet water, and mariculture, I'm not sure where the term came from, but believe me, it has gained prominence. Possibly strengthened through this food from the ocean, the report and the scientific opinion.
You know, one of the most important points made in the evidence review report of food from the oceans is the question about the different trophic levels. And at the moment, if you're just taking fish, you're actually working on a very high trophic level, because fish feeds on lower creatures and so on and so on. And it's actually, in terms of efficiency, relatively low. And actually the efficiency of fish is actually less than that of agricultural products, which feed directly on plant materials. So the logic of the report is that if you go down the trophic levels, you're actually increasing efficiency. On the other hand, of course, the point has always been made that then you also take away the basis for the higher trophic levels. And this is this balancing act that comes out of this report, which I think is extremely important. So there are two elements to that. There's the consequence of it in terms of science advice, but there's also, I think, a very important educational part of this, because this is not something that most people actually think about. So by explaining this to more and more people, and this is where the outreach, I think, is important, we also make sure that the consumers actually understand this point about efficiency, which also, of course, again, has all sorts of implications for the future. So there is both a direct science advice, but there's also, in a sense, the broader issue of bringing out a very, very basic biological point to a larger audience.
Sorry to intervene, Pearl. I share the view that scientists have to work without money for the common goods, no doubt. But in the rapid mechanism we're talking about 3 months, which means that the experts we are asking have to rearrange travel plans, they have to find someone to do the lab work, they have to find someone to do the lecturing, a lot of things, and they sit together for weeks and not for hours as they do currently. So we need a new organization, and only for those I'm campaigning because it's a turn in the life. We need to be competitive with the Deloittes, and we must be over-competitive concerning in time, over-competitive when it comes to quality, and we could do that, but we need to think carefully what we do, and if we make the differentiation, then it could probably be a step forward.
Point well taken.
I would still say that there is a competition. So I do not question them, actually. I myself have spent a lot of work working for academies without any remuneration whatsoever. However, we must be aware that there is a competition. So people are asked to do one task which is remunerated, they are asked another task that is not remunerated, and obviously in some cases that will influence their decision. So it's a competitive market. There is a shortage of expertise in many areas. We already know in the academic world we have enormous problems with reviewing of papers for scientific journals. And I'm involved myself as an editor. Typically now we have to ask at least 10 or 15 reviews in order to get 2 or 3 people to review an article. Again, that is usually not remunerated. So there are some real tensions as more and more advice is given. And so I'm very glad to hear that Johannes Klumpers is willing to look into this, because as I say, at the end of the day, idealism is there, but idealism can sometimes be very significantly tempered by other competitive approaches.
Thanks very much. I'm pleased that halfway through our event we have already a sort of a concrete idea of what can be done. I would now thank my panelists for your insights, ideas, exchanges, talks, and invite my next panel to join me here on the stage. So this would be Günter Stock, Evangelia Anzani, Andy Hart, and Johannes Klumpers. I don't know. I can sit on. Okay, welcome. We will now talk about another very, very practical example of science advice to policy, namely another case study, authorization processes of plant protection products in Europe. We will proceed just as before. Each of the speakers has 5 to 7 minutes, and we'll then engage in a discussion with you, the audience. I would like to start with you, Evangelia, if I may. Just have to find my cards here. So Professor Evangelia Anzani is a pediatrician and epidemiologist. She is head of the Department of Hygiene and Epidemiology at the School of Medicine at the University of Ioannina in Greece. And she is also the chair of the SAPEA Working Group on Pesticide Toxicity Assessment. Evangelia's work mainly deals with evidence assessment, with environmental epidemiology, the genetic epidemiology of complex diseases, and with motivating behavior change. And Evangelia will be talking to us about incorporating evidence into scientific policy advice.
Dear members of the public, dear distinguished hosts and guests, dear colleagues, it is with great joy and honor to stand with you today before you. And for this opportunity, I would like to convey to Alia my sincere gratitude, that and of my colleagues from the working group, from the SAPEA Working Group for the Plant Protection Products Evidence Report. In the next minutes, I will share with you my thoughts as they were formulated during the last several months, where we strived to provide a robust scientific background for a very important fundamental policy question. More importantly, I would like to share with you a vision where the values and preferences of the public, of the European citizens, will be aligned with and best served by scientists and innovators, but most of all, policymakers and legislators. An integral part of this vision is a scheme like the chief scientific advisors and their excellent team, and a synergy like SAPEA. During the past months, I have been privileged to work closely with both these entities and I have only praise to express for their extraordinary effort to transform vision into reality. So in my first slide, there is a blurry figure that is included in the evidence review report for plant protection products, for PPPs. I will be referring to them for the sake of time and convenience. So this will soon be delivered to the scientific community, and of course this pertains directly to a specific policy question and legislation question as well, which is whether a plant protection product should be approved for use and what use might that be. And this figure depicts our target process for us, the working group, the SAPIA working group for the specific evidence report. Of course, there is no way that you can make sense of any of the information that is provided. I only want you to reflect upon the complexity of the process and the interdependence of the various attributes that constitute the task at hand. So, in brief, we had to deal with 5 milestones incorporated and integrated into the approval process, into the regulatory process for plant protection products. That would be data accumulation, data collection, data evaluation, integrated of this data into a well-defined, validated endpoint system that should be integrated into a functional IT framework for the European Commission, and finally, provision of risk characterization outputs. As a working group, we were specifically asked to provide the scientific in human health risk assessment for PPPs and all the attributes that pertain to that specific question. Addressing such a challenge requires a systematic, well-structured, comprehensive, iterative approach that would also be fit for purpose. And why? Because first of all, we need to formulate and refine the research question or the question under study. Every question is unique, and moreover, underneath every question lies a very complex system of conflicts of interest which can operate in different directions for that research question or policy question or legislation question. And conflicts of interest aside, every question can also have other peculiarities. For example, the PPP-related question was notoriously difficult to ask because the scientific field was rich in information and mature policy-wise. Moreover, the eyes of the public were upon the specific question due to the recent media coverage on the glyphosate decisions, regulatory decisions and scientific decisions. So while formulating our strategy, it was evident that we could not limit ourselves only to the content of the regulatory process. We had also had to focus on the timing of the process as it is formulated, as new evidence comes in, and again on the process itself. So the various gears that would comprise the whole regulatory process are well placed, and if yes, are they well fed by the evidence? Moving on to the evidence itself, it is very important to understand that for this specific scientific field, we were swimming in a sea of data. So we had to pose to address this sea of data in a structured way, and we have to tier the various assessment steps during and while we're reaching a final report or a final decision. So, first of all, we need to decide upon what constitutes the evidence, real evidence, meaning evidence that is related to the question itself. We had to understand whether we have the appropriate methodology to address the data and whether we have the capacity as a scientific community to address the data. If the answer to both these questions is yes, then we can proceed to the next step, which is when is adequate evidence available to inform decisions? And here, you know already from your fields that there are phenomena such as the winner's curse, where we know that preliminary findings, although very important in exploratory schemes for further research, often overestimate the effect under study. So we have to wait. We have, in a way, to model and project the available evidence and then be able to say that at this point we are in the position to proceed with evidence assessment. So time is an important aspect here, and good data, good quality data, is another really important aspect in the second step of assessing the evidence. And finally, and more importantly, how can credible evidence can be ensured? So this is a term of validity. This is a matter of bias operating in the field. By definition, we know that bias will be present. We cannot eliminate it, but we can control for it. And more importantly, we can describe it. And if we're lucky, we can adjust for it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Evangelia, and for those closing words, which make us think, and I think are extremely helpful. Let me try to just come back to some of the things that you've said. You started by saying that one has to be aware of the fact that each question is complex, and this is not a trivial thing. So one has to take time to understand the question and the issues that are underlying and at stake. One also then has to think about what kind of evidence is needed and what kind of data is needed to address these questions, and that the issue of good quality data is also one that doesn't have to be understood. You talk about the importance of timing in several respects, and you reminded us of the fact that we have to be aware of biases, also biases in many different contexts, and I think this is a very useful reminder in the context of our discussion. And you again mentioned the importance of a multidisciplinarity approach when forming a group of assessors for evidence and when thinking about the questions and issues at hand. And yes, you also said that framing the issue, the question that has to be studied, also needs to be informed by several perspectives, and this is something that you came back to at the very end. I would like to hand over to Professor Stock. Yes, that early. You want your input now. But, well, this is the surprise element today. And I will make you wait another minute, Professor Stock, just to introduce you very briefly. So, Professor Stock is the outgoing ALEA president. He worked as ALEA president since 2012. He was also chair of SAPEA until late 2017 and is now SAPEA board member. Professor Stock is a physiologist by training. He has held many positions in academia and industry. Between 2006 and 2015, he was the president of the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences in Germany, and he is currently the chair of the executive board of the Einstein Foundation and also member of the Charité Supervisory Board in Berlin. Professor Stock, we listen to you.
SAPEA is now working in real operation since approximately 1.5 years, and I would like to share a few experiences out of this time. And fortunately, I can echo some of the statements which have been made before, but I would like to add a certain amount of own ideas on this topic. The first and utmost experience, again in this position, was to really understand and honestly, and when I say honestly, it does not mean tactically and it does not mean opportunistic, and honestly ask yourself, what we as scientists can really, and academies can really contribute to the questions at stake. I think this is a very, very important point, and it should not be underestimated. And I would like to make the case in the pesticide case. In the pesticide, the question was an overall question. We heard a little bit of that. But there were parts in it where we definitely as scientists could not contribute. For example, why do different countries, based on the same scientific basis, nevertheless decide differently? So we had to carefully carve out what can scientists honestly with the knowledge today, what can they answer and not. Of course, we have some scientific, sociological data on risk awareness and things like that, and we did the workshop on this question. But this is more general, and it is not at the level of micro data which would be needed in order to answer those questions. So this is the point one. And we do have to make it very clear, and we must be very conscious when we write our reports what is fact, what is educated guess, and what is just guess. I think this is a very complicated and very honest endeavor where we want to be truthful. In any case, we will at almost each step come to the question of uncertainty. How do we go about this? And a good working group will always address this question. So my trust in those working groups, that they really address this topic, has grown over the years. Second point is we, in the academies, 100 academies, have to identify excellent experts. Again, I would argue that our academies have to dig deeper sometimes to find the real experts and not in an opportunistic way just nominate one because it is likely that this guy would like to be part of it. It is a very complicated effort and very honest. We need expertise. We need, and this is something where we have to become better, the geographic distribution can be and should be improved. Gender is an issue all in our committees. And when we talk about expertise, we must be fair and really ask the obvious expertise, but also the non-obvious expertise. And in all fairness, I must say, in many cases, we coming from natural sciences, I'm a medic, we sometimes forget social scientists and the humanities as being a needed expertise. I think we can improve in this field as well. And then the next topic is to convince the experts to really go to the work and take it serious. And I must apologize, sometimes experts are nominated by academies, and the feedback why the expert has not been chosen is not yet perfect, and I really have to excuse that we are not yet good at this, but we will definitely improve, because there are many reasons not to take this or that expert. The third point is we have to help with the elicitation workshop where experts are asked towards the topic which is at stake. And again, here we have an eminent role as academies to bring in experts and to bring in and take care that the real questions are being asked and probably even answered. And after that, it comes to a point which is still not good enough. And we as scientists have a little bit of lack of understanding. When the expert report is published, it is of utmost importance that we go out in our academies and tell the people what was the process, the question, what was the process, and what was the outcome. We can create very lively academic work if we take those data which are accomplished by SAPIA and talk to the people, because in the end, you made the point earlier, we are not advising the politicians of today only. We are advising also the politicians of tomorrow, and we are advising and helping for judgment our fellow citizens. And therefore, we as academies, we have the opportunity and the responsibility to get those data discussed with the people, and therefore this public interaction, it is not teaching, it is public interaction, is of utmost importance. And what we learned in the first year, it really works. It really works, and there is a high preparedness. Please, all academies, step in and do that. Now, I would like to have a personal remark after many years of advising. It is a hell of a decision, and it takes a lot of wisdom to decide when do you give options, when do you give a concrete advice, and when do you feel that you have to campaign for your scientific opinion. Stem cells, for example, in my country is just an example of this kind. And this leads directly to the question, how do these three patterns, what we do in our advice business, how do they reflect on trustworthiness? And we do have a trustworthiness of today, but we have a trustworthiness also of tomorrow. And I would like to see that we take a lot of thinking and wisdom in doing these things. My last point is derived from the last discussion we had here, and I may say that as an outgoing person from the SAPEA work, of course I wish them success, but what I really wish is that we can go beyond the 5 years and that we get enough support to really go on, because 5 years in this process of advising is almost the beginning, and we have to consolidate, and I think we have learned and we have earned the respect over the last years that we should go on. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Professor Stock. So this was a direct appeal also to Johannes to think about how to consolidate European science advice, and I think he'll take this back to Brussels. Professor Stock, you spoke about the need to honestly assess what scientists can actually contribute, and this is another not trivial issue. What can academies contribute? What can they not do? And what can they promise? What can't they promise? You also made the distinction between facts, educated guessing, and guessing. Another distinction worth reflecting on. You said that it's important to make more efforts to identify the really best experts and to be as diverse as possible in order to address the topics at hand, and to also include perspectives of scientists and sciences that are not maybe at the first sight the ones that are most or appear to be most relevant for the topic, and this goes in particular to humanities and social sciences. And you stressed again the need for public interaction, and you said that you were very pleased to see that this actually works with the SAPEA context, so this is very reassuring. Johannes, your name came up several times already, so now it's your time to take the floor. Dr. Johannes Klumpers leads the SAM mechanism in the European Commission since it was established in 2015. His unit also supports the European Group on Ethics in Science and New Technologies. He has a background in forestry and wood technology. Johannes joined the DG RTD in 1998 and has worked there on a broad variety of issues, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Julia, for the nice introduction. Good morning to all. I am here as I was introduced as the head of the Scientific Advice Mechanism Unit in the Commission, so I am not one of the chief scientific advisors. And you have just to imagine that I would be female, that I would have blonde hair and not reddish as I have. And imagine Pearl, whom you've seen before, so basically this is what you have to imagine when you hear me talking, because all these science advisors, they among themselves take more responsibility for certain topics than for others. Not responsibility, but they are involved more in certain topics than in others. And when it came to the pesticides, the three members of the group of chief scientific advisors, namely Rolf Heuer, Paul Nurse and Janusz Bojnicki, who were the three that were quite heavily involved, were the ones involved from the beginning in the evidence gathering phases and everything. None of them was available to come here today, unfortunately. So I am actually basically replacing one of them here. And another important aspect is that the opinion on the scientific opinion on the plant protection products, the authorization processes of plant protection products, is not out yet. It will be out in a couple of days, was not out yet, so we cannot really give you the recommendations that will be in there. So I will, on the other hand, hopefully mention some other aspects that I think were interesting aspects, interesting lessons from that topic. Now, it's called authorization processes of plant protection products. Now, you would think when you start with such a topic, oh, that's easy, it's a piece of cake. Just let's take all those professors around the world who are heading a department called authorization processes of plant protection products. And we didn't find any, actually. So, this is this title is a typical policy title. It's a typical title that Peter Halligan was mentioning earlier, comes from the demand side. And so there has to be some translation made into where do we go? And Evangelia has described it, and Günther has described it. Where do we go to find actually scientific input into that question? And so that is definitely part of the problem of this topic, and I'll go into this a little bit more. And another one is the discussions. Evangelia was mentioning it. I mean, it is almost daily in newspapers, either about glyphosate, either about neonicotinoids, either about 75% insects have gone since 20 years ago or something like that. So it's a topic that is of high interest to the citizens, otherwise all those journalists wouldn't write about it. Risk assessment, which is one of the underlying mechanisms when it comes to the authorization of plant protection products, is also not a single scientific discipline where you can go to. Risk assessment in itself relies again on many disciplines, like epidemiology, for example, which was represented, environmental sciences, biology, and plenty of disciplines again. And when you are then entering into a question like authorization processes, you are maybe providing advice at the end that even goes into what people believe, oh, this is actually not science advice. What you're doing here is actually politics. And so with that topic, you are entering into a situation where you are at a very fine borderline between, and here it comes back, Peter Halligan was mentioning it, brokerage. So we want, I think like most or every decent scientific advisor wants to be having that role, namely brokering, namely helping the policymakers solving their problems. And when you do so, you are leaving that realm of comfortable, pure scientist. You are engaging into how laws are drafted. You are engaging into the process of making laws, into the timelines of making laws. You are then noticing that there is maybe not only one regulation that is of impact, that is of interest to pesticides, but there is also the Water Framework Directive. There is also the regulations on maximum residue levels in food. There is the Sustainable Use Directive on pesticides. And all of this makes it complex in terms of reply and in terms of engagement. How do you link the scientific evidence on the one side to the advice that you then give? And how you do that, you may actually go in a way describing your advice that indeed some policymakers might feel this is actually transgression. You are actually entering to my field with what you say here. This is not for you, science advisors, to making these kind of comments. This is for me, policymakers, dealing with it. So this is a problem that we are facing with this. And now, when it comes to how we worked, I would like, first of all, to thank SAPEA and Evangelia and David Cogan, who is not here, and Nina Hoppan, who is sitting also there from the SAPEA team, who have been very instrumental, who have been essential in looking into part of the evidence that we were taking into account then when it comes to the scientific opinion. In this topic, we were not able to, right from the start, to set up a or several working groups that could, from SAPEA, that would deal with all of the aspects that then later on we thought were needed to go in this scientific opinion. So the SAPEA, they have concentrated on health aspects, and they did that very well, and all that work done by SAPEA is used. You will see that later on when it is out. It is used, it is referenced in that opinion. We also were relying on SAPEA for a workshop on risk acceptance, risk perception, is by the people, by the citizens. Is a very important aspect, and that work is used as well. And then we have ourselves gone, we had to do that quite quickly, into an environmental expert sounding board to also look into these environmental risk assessment aspects that are also of very high importance with the pesticides. So this is a concrete example of a topic where you are getting into that difficulty when you want to be all-encompassing with your disciplines. You are entering into an interdisciplinary context, and that includes political science, that includes social science. We had that already with the Food from the Oceans, and the colleagues, and Ian is one of them, they were so kind that they didn't feel that there was transgression when it came to the political science aspects in the Food from the Oceans topic, but that risk can happen, and I'm not sure whether the other colleagues dealing with the pesticides will feel the same when that is out. And what lessons or experiences, what has been maybe striking, that is maybe a little bit personal in relation to what I take from this topic, and what becomes very clear also looking at the question of risk acceptance, risk perception, is that when you compare this to the medical area, where there is drugs that are consumed by all of us, some of us on a daily basis, or on a weekly or monthly, or whenever you are sick and you take medication, we all know that in the medical areas there have been drugs that have had very unpleasant side effects. Still, this doesn't lead to a general distrust in society as regards medication or drugs. Most of us are happily following the advice they get by their doctors. Maybe not all, but most of us do. And most of us do not put into question the way how drugs are authorized, all the process that is going into that authorization. But when it comes to pesticides, the story is entirely different. What you read about with pesticides is, oh, it is a danger to environment. It is maybe a danger to health. And then you don't read anything about it, what it brings to you, actually, a pesticide maybe. Oh, that's something for the farmers, it helps them. But it's not anything that helps me as a citizen. Whereas with the drugs, you are aware drugs are dangerous. You are aware that there have been problems maybe in the past, but you are also aware that drugs, overall, they help you in getting along with your disease. And that, everyone knows that. And with the pesticides, it's different. So when you read about it, it's all risk. It's all, you don't really maybe know why actually do those people actually deal with authorizing pesticides. Can't we do without them? And so that the public has a different attitude towards them than when it comes to drugs, I would think. And that also reads again, the question of trust was addressed yesterday as my last comment, and today as well. And it is evident that in the area of those researchers, scientists that do work in risk assessment of pesticides, they are not necessarily trusted. And there is a lot of distrust. There are, in the European Parliament, clearly a high number of parliamentarians, just to give you one example, that do not trust, that even believe there was bribery in place. They question the integrity of the researchers, of the risk assessors that were assessing different pesticides. And not only they do question integrity almost automatically for those that are employed by industry, they are not trusted by them at all, but they also question more and more government scientists from the government bodies that are involved in the authorization processes of plant protection products. So we are here in a field where this distrust issue is very important, and I think it is not evident how to deal with gaining that trust, gaining back that trust, because it was discussed, you have to gain trust, it is not there automatically. And I do not have an immediate answer how to do this. What definitely needs to be done is that we do our best to provide excellent science, to provide it in a way that it is helpful to policymakers, and to explain it also to the public the best we can. I think that is necessary for trust building, and it will not be easy in a topic like this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Johannes. You have given us another set of issues to think about, some of them reflecting what was said earlier, like the role of science advisors as brokers, taking up what Peter said this morning, the importance and the awareness that one will have to leave the comfort zone, and this might also result in tensions, something that is not excluded and that is part of the basket. You spoke about the fact that policy questions like authorization processes are very, very complex, and this needs to be figured in when trying to tackle those issues. You mentioned again the importance of interdisciplinarity in tackling those issues, bringing in different perspectives. And at the very end, you spoke again about trust and distrust, and that while scientists overall are still rather trusted, this trust cannot be taken for granted. And you gave the example of risk assessment, and that we have to think about ways to gain trust, and mainly by explaining, reaching out, engaging with others. So thanks for this. I now hand over to Andy, our last speaker on this panel. Dr. Andy Hart is a visiting professor of risk analysis practice at Newcastle University. He was previously at the UK Food and Environment Research Agency and served for 9 years on the European Food Safety Expert Panel on Pesticides. Andy is interested in approaches to uncertainty, the weight of evidence, and expert judgment and risk assessment, so he's the man for this panel. And the title of his talk is Key Requirements for Scientific Regulatory Assessment. Please, Andrew.
Thank you. So I was not a member of the working group for SAPIA on this topic, but I attended 2 of its workshops. And I think my role here today is to bring from those workshops some topics that were discussed, which are of wider relevance to the general themes of the last couple of days, and in particular, trust and the science policy interface. A key issue for trust in regulatory science is how sure we are that the regulatory process, the science that's used in the regulatory process, actually achieves the goals, the societal goals that are set down in legislation. In the case of pesticides, this goal is written in the legislation, and it states that the process should ensure that there are not any harmful effects of pesticides on human health or the environment. The risk assessment process that's used, for example, for human health, uses this risk metric. It uses the no adverse effect level in rodents, divides it by a factor of 100 to allow for extrapolation within and between species and other uncertainties, and compares it to a conservative estimate of exposure. If the exposure is lower, the pesticide is approved, at least for that aspect of risk. Otherwise, further investigation or non-approval may follow. Of course, the appropriateness, the trustworthiness of this process as a means of achieving that societal goal, that protection goal, depends upon the relation between these two things, between the risk metric on the one hand and what we think the protection goal really means. And to achieve that understanding, we need to do 3 things. We need to, first of all, define what exactly we mean by that protection goal. What do we mean by harmful effect? What are the list of harmful effects that will be of concern to policymakers, to society? What do we mean by not any? Do we mean literally not any, nobody in the whole of the European population? Or is that achievable? Do we need to specify some acceptable level of risk? And what do we mean by ensure? Do we mean literally 100% certainty that there will be not any harmful effects? or do we mean some adequate level of certainty, some acceptable risk? This has to be defined before we can calibrate the relationship between that policy objective and the assessment procedures and the risk metric that are used in the regulatory process, which necessarily has to be simple enough for practical routine use. Once we've done that, and I do apologise for the text falling, but the slides are now narrower than they were at the beginning of the morning. Once we've done those first two steps, defining and calibrate, we need to assess. For individual pesticides, we don't need to revisit the calibration because it only has to be done once. We need to apply the regulatory process that's been defined, and we need to be alert for any additional uncertainties affecting specific pesticides and assess their extra impact case by case. Methods for these three steps have recently been set out in guidance produced by EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, on uncertainty in scientific assessment. And so there is detailed guidance on how to do these things. Calibration is the key element for gaining trustworthiness, and so I'd like to show a bit more about what that involves. Ideally, what we'd like to do is to quantify precisely the relationship between the risk metric that we're using in the regulatory process and the protection goal as it is defined more precisely, and to see what the relationship is and to compare that to the defined level of acceptable risk, whatever that might be. That, of course, will be a societal risk management policy judgment. But of course, we won't have perfect epidemiological data to quantify the vertical axis of this graph. We will have more limited data combined with expert knowledge, and that leads to uncertainty. We must take this uncertainty into account, and that's been mentioned a couple of times earlier on in the earlier talks. Once we've quantified our uncertainty about the relationship, we can then identify what would be a critical value for regulation. If, for example, we were looking for 95% certainty that the acceptable risk would not be exceeded, then we need if we wanted a 90% certainty, we would need a 95% confidence interval, and then we could read off from this relationship, we could infer what would be the critical value that would be appropriate to use in the regulatory process to achieve the societal goal. So, the details of this procedure would differ from situation to situation. It depends on the nature of the policy objective, on the nature of the risk metric, and on the type of evidence that you have available to quantify, to assess that relationship. But the principles are general, and they apply to any area of regulatory science. They apply, for example, to genetically modified organisms, to food contact materials, to food additives. In all of these areas, you have a protection goal defined in some way in the regulation, often with words very similar to this, and you have a risk assessment process involving a risk metric, which is often quite simple, and the relationship needs to be defined. I think this is also relevant. The same principles would apply in the Food for the Oceans recommendations, where it talks about optimising the regulatory toolbox so as to ensure that the policy goals are met and that the future biodiversity of the seas is maintained while also increasing food production. So, altogether then, this process is key to these three principles we've been discussing the last 3 days. Of course, the assessment process over here is science on its own. As Evangelia said, we're swimming in a sea of data. But it's only scientific to use that for the purpose of regulation, for the purpose of achieving this regulatory goal, if we understand that relationship. That's key for it to be scientific. And by calibrating that relationship, we make transparent the justification for using that risk metric, that regulatory approach to achieve that societal objective. And furthermore, by calibrating it, we establish the basis for trustworthiness of the approach. We show people that there is objective reason to believe that if we operate in this way, that the regulatory, the policy objectives, the societal objectives will be achieved with the required, desired level of certainty. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. This was, I think, a proof for a social science perspective and the need for it in this kind of project. And it reminded us for the need for an ambiguous definitions for the goals of the policies of the regulations. This is something that should take quite a substantial role in the entire process. You also said that assessment procedures have to be calibrated in order to deliver those goals with the required level of uncertainty. I think these were really one of the two main issues of your talk. I wouldn't want to go beyond this because we're a little short of time, so I would want to ask for your questions immediately, so please make up your mind very quickly. I have one question here, one question there. I see another one, so we take those two questions, one after the other. Peter, please.
This question is for Gunther. Towards the end of your talk, you mentioned about the issue of framing advice, maybe aspects, and you offered a taxonomy with regard to that. And the question I have is built upon Johan's presentation of the potential for transgression, and that is moving between science advice and policy making. Your taxonomy was based on options, concrete proposals, and advocacy. Are there any ground rules for SAPIA with regard to this?
Shall I go there? Oh, sorry. Thank you very much for that question. I mean, we are, when it comes to this kind of terminology, what I am referring to, and I think most people do, is to this book by Pielke, where he divided those four roles. One was the broker, the other one was the advocate, and there's this pure scientist and so on. And so far, in our work, in that combined effort of SAPEA and the chief science advisors, we have delivered, we tried to be, in most of the scientific opinion, in what we call scientific opinions, we try to broker. So we try to provide advice in forms of options, most frequently that help addressing the issue and that help providing solutions. What was also done is in another type of document which is called explanatory note, and that is actually, you could refer to this as a pure science element, whereby the scientists limit themselves to describe a the scientific state of the art in relation to a question without making any recommendations. And to me it was a surprise that that in the European Commission is an enormously useful document. In Pielke's book, the role of pure scientist is considered as being not very useful to the policymaker. In the reality of what I've seen in the Commission, this is not the case, because the big explanatory note we did on the science advisors did, and with also SAPEA experts on the new techniques in agricultural biotechnology, has proven useful. It was even interesting for the legal service, who was going back to it and the way how this was described, and they were using it in a court case actually as one of the scientific inputs, and it has helped clarifying certain ideas. It didn't contribute to any policy suggestion in relation to a new regulation or these kind of things, but it has been a useful element, and I would actually, with hindsight now, I would not underestimate the usefulness of a pure science approach as well in certain cases. Was that the answer? I don't know.
Yeah, but I think it comes back to the idea, the straining into advocacy. I wanted to understand where the limitations are with regard to, because if one feels that one has a very strong scientific case, would one stop short of that?
Yeah, I can say a sentence about that. I mean, when you look at both the food from the oceans and the pesticide, when you are involving political scientists in your expert groups, which we did in both of the cases, political scientists, they look as political scientists into how political systems work. and they make then suggestions as to in what framework policy should take place and so on. And some of their suggestions and some of their wording are identical to maybe what policymakers do, European Commission or other policymakers. Some of them might, on the other hand, using the same type of wording, but might recommend something totally different. And that is, so when you are involving political scientists and you are getting into these political frameworks, and they come at it from a scientific angle, but it might not be perceived like this by the policymaker. It might actually be perceived by the policymaker as being advocacy, meaning you policymaker, this is what you should do with that regulation. And then as the type of wording that is used by political scientists, the way how they think, the way how they formulate, is very close to the reality of thinking and formulating in a body like the European Commission. Here the risk of being perceived as advocate is much higher than it is when it comes to natural science, where natural science is never translated one-to-one from a natural science result into policy.
There was a second question. Susan.
I have a very simple question, and it would be great to hear a sentence or two from all the panel members. When you refer to the public, who do you mean?
I think I should answer in the following way, that it depends. We have different sorts of public. What we experience in SAPEA, we have had expert public, experts in this group. We have the classical guests in academies, and I think the creativity of the last year existed in the fact that we tried different formats where we tried to get, with extra events, to get the normal public, those would normally not come to the academy, where we attracted and tried to convey the message as we could. I think we have to be very differentiated who we address with what kind of messages, and I think we are at the beginning of our creativity process to make this public interaction better than it used to be. Is that somehow okay? Thank you.
So I think coming up with a straightforward answer, the public is everyone. Because for topics like that, every member of the community has a vested interest in the decisions that are related to regulatory assessment. So there is a huge activity on stakeholder engagement of different groups of stakeholders. They should be there from all different members and groups. So we could have a general public for pesticides. We should have a member of the public as cohabit people who live near fields, people who consume products that have pesticide residues in them. We need professionals, we need scientists, we need the industry, we need regulators, we need legislators, we need scientists that could be affected by the legislation indirectly. So a stakeholder matrix is something that is very important at the very beginning of these projects and at the very end of these projects.
I was also thinking of the public at large, of everyone, meaning that can be the reader of The Guardian as well as the reader of The Sun, or the user of Facebook or the user of Twitter, just mentioning some means of getting to them. And it's a difficulty talking about everyone, I agree.
My inclination would be to interpret the public in as inclusive a way as possible, while also recognising that there's not just one public, but many different publics. However, I'm not an expert on this issue, and so in the recent work which EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, has done, developing guidance on how to communicate scientific uncertainty in its assessments, There's a public consultation on the draft guidance at the present time, which you could contribute to. Very welcome. In that process, EFSA involved also some social scientists, and we thought with them very carefully about how the range of publics and audiences influenced what EFSA would communicate about scientific uncertainty and through which of the media and formats that it was communicating, how that would differ between them, and how to maintain coherence between it so that you don't end up sending contradictory messages.
I don't want to be critical. Of course, we want to reach everybody, but it is a mess and a hell of work to really do it, because you need different approaches, and we need more creativity, and in the end, we need more money for that. Thank you.
One last question.
This is not a question, it's just a comment coming from me. This is a reactivity, because this is in front of Johannes and Pearl about, for example, microplastics, because after the Food for Motion, it was clear that microplastic is a problem in Europe and in every part of the world, and it was raised by Sir Sam at the end of March. And we discussed that during the HLG meeting and the SAPIA, and we agreed that we have 3 steps to work on. So microplastic now is on the way. It's a very hot topic, so the reactivity is very good. Coming from the SAM, coming from SAPIA, coming from HLG. I'm sorry, because this is the whole term from HLG. So the reactivity is very good for the public, for ourselves. So this is a very good point for this new mechanism.
Good. Thanks very much. Thanks to my panel. Big applause. We are nearing the end of our symposium today, and would now like to spend just a couple of minutes on reflections. And I will slightly change the format that we had foreseen, so I will not ask my 4 panelists to join me here, but I'd rather ask you to come one after the other in front of the stage. I'll give you a microphone, and the idea is now that we are asking some of our academies to share their thoughts about today's meeting with us, their reflections, the things that stuck with you, that impressed you, the things that intrigued you, that worried you. So if I can call you one after the other to come here and share your thoughts with the audience, and then I'd like to hear also the thoughts of all the others, the ones. So what will stay with you after you will have left the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences today. So I would say we start with Professor Ulrike Thielmann. She is Vice President of the Royal Society. Ulrike, I'll give you my mic. Okay. Or should I just turn it on? If you can turn it down. I don't want you to be with your back to the audience.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to make some comments. There was so much today to take in, and also the topics went in different directions, and I'm, I think, in danger to add to that. So, but just a few things. I mean, one question we didn't actually hear is what is actually science advice? Of course, it was interpreted quite clearly, I think, science advice to governments, to policy makers. I think, of course, from that point of view, we have also heard the discussion, how far do you get? How far do you go? I thought the name of just calling it an evidence review report is a very interesting one. There was no advice there in this title. But I think advice can also go beyond that. Advice can also be advised by scientists, and that might be in our own purpose, for our own self-serving to some extent. I mean, for example, the Royal Society was asked or prompted to make a statement about Brexit. And of course, we know what the scientific community wants, and we clearly want to express that. And I think that is science advice as well, that we need to advise governments what we think is good for science. But then finally, I think just to think about science advice for politicians and for policy making is too narrow, because I think science advice needs to be broader. broader for the society. Again, just quoting one example, and actually that came up as well just on the panel session. Science and law is very closely connected. And so at the Royal Society we have a sequence of science and law conversations which seems to be very popular and has now been taken up by also the American National Arts Academy. So finally, we are here a congregation of academies. So really what is the job of the academies to go into this? And I think one thing, again, maybe from my previous comments, is we need to keep the channel of conversation open. We need to be aware. We need to build networks. We need to think ahead, right? Because sometimes it's actually the scientists who know what sort of issues might come up, say, for example, in data science. When there's a breakthrough that it can be game-changing, then these issues can actually be formulated by us. And I think also we need to wonder about what is the infrastructure really for science advice. And I think it depends from country to country, also internationally it's different. But I think we need to build this infrastructure, and I think paying possibly for advice is part of that. So I guess to summarize this point is, I think we need to hold bandwidths of science advice, and we need to maintain that. And that's a big job, I think.
Now I ask Professor Elżbieta Jakobiak to come here to share her thoughts on today. So she's the Vice President of the Polish Academy of Sciences.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am very happy that can say a few words about SAP, about SAPEA, and I am very happy that this small baby, because it is really a very near-born baby, which is already so success. And I am also very happy to say that there is one Polish, Janusz Bujnicki, who is playing a really important role as a molecular biologist. He was very useful for all this recent work. So, and I am sure that it is just the only selected expert, because it was mentioned that selected only very well top scientists should be selected as expert, and I think it is a good example. Also, what I was remarked that during all these final sessions, there are a lot of speakers who are speaking about interdisciplinarity. It is, and also what was very nicely mentioned by one person, that problems are interdisciplinary, and it was going very well with food ocean. How much this problem is open to many different types of scientists, to very different disciplines. And as you told also, it should not be silos between food, ocean and agriculture. Everything is connected. We should think about everything. It was mentioned that this food ocean report was done so quickly, so efficient and so on. I am afraid that maybe it was done so quickly because the subject is a little bit long term. Also was mentioned that long term it was not for now, it is for next generation. Yes, if I understand. And it was done also that we need to grow this food a little bit depth. I think you are mentioning about that. So it will be another problems. So maybe it was so quick because it was not touching us so directly. Not now, just it will be somewhere, so we can make a decision very quickly. How to take this food, where to grow it, just in the ocean or in Baltic, or this story can be different completely. And of course, this interdisciplinary is very important. And long term, what you mentioned, that we must think a little bit in the future, not as a politician which only want to have position in the next election, which is just case in our country, I suppose. And what I am thinking here, we are academicians, we are really top scientists and top politicians taken from European Union, but maybe there is not normal politician. They maybe should learn, listen a little bit us. I think we are a little bit disconnected. Okay, it is after some messages given maybe to them, but some indirect. I don't know if it will be not good case to invite them or to give them direct. A lot of interesting messages were given there, but I don't know if it is going to politicians to politicians from the countries, these normal politicians, not necessarily to European Union, how to convince them, because they are in their own world a little bit, and not always scientists are convincing them about importance of some problems, of some issues. Okay, so, and I like very much what was taught. It is one science only, one common science, and we should fight for this to make it better and better. Okay, thank you very much.
So, Professor Peter Kennedy. Professor Kennedy is president of the Royal Irish Academy.
Okay, Ireland, we're a little country, but we get engaged in science advice, and we take very seriously our interaction with European bodies, especially the ESEC and ALIA. So the opportunity to be involved in SAPEA was extremely important for us. The Food for the Oceans project, we had 2 people working on the team. One a standard scientist and one very much from economic sciences. I saw the report come back, the SAPEA report, which is the scientific evidence, and then we've the Food from the Oceans, what used to be called the high-level group, but it seems to have disappeared. It's now called the
Chief Scientific Advisor.
Group of Chief Scientific Advisors. Okay. There's constant change in Brussels. Anyway, when that came back, we had a briefing at home. As we do, we have a breakfast briefing. We brought the material back to Ireland, shared it with policymakers at home, shared it with others at home. And actually, going to it, I learned so much more about it wasn't just the science. When we talk about the food from the oceans, there was that question of you take more food, well then maybe you've fish farms or farms that are impinging on tourist attractions or other events. And so it was very, very interesting. Then there was a whole discussion about the economics and what's happening at the moment and the implications for Ireland in terms of Brexit. Where were we actually collecting some of the food from the oceans? And so fascinating. And I think the multidisciplinary aspect of it was absolutely important. So for a small academy, I think this SAPEA is fantastic. It allows us to bring things back locally. It allows us to contribute to these wider policies. And I think the interdisciplinarity of it is fantastic for us. So that's my comment.
Estonian Academy of Sciences.
So it's now only me between you and lunch. And to start with, I want to say that there are some differences between internationally renowned experts and mathematicians by education. Differently from experts, mathematicians give you absolutely correct and absolutely useless answer. But they both appear uninvited, and they both don't care what is behind the numbers. There was a lot of speaking today about trust and building of trust. From a mathematical point of view, building of trust is extremely asymmetric. So you build that in years, sometimes in generations, like Ole Peterson was telling, but if you lose that in minutes. And in terms of science advice, the major reason for losing trust in eyes of public, in eyes of policymakers, is if you are arrogant. In Estonia, we are building a science advice system. We are bringing together scientists, media people, policymakers, government officers, but we strictly limit access of academy members to those meetings. It's people who do the advice, so it's going to stop. So I'm not trying to be patronizing with respect to statistically saying older generation, but life is changing in a pace which many, especially scientists, cannot follow. And if we want to make science advice operational, then, very simply speaking, we have to locate those people whom we can call on Saturday night and who will take the job. This means sort of circular effect. In very old times, Newton science, being a scientist, was a hobby of rich people. Then, with the nuclear bomb, etc., came science as lifestyle. Now it has been turned into diagnosis, and it will be addiction very soon. But back to the science advisory mechanism and this sort of advice which is being built now. I think that there are three paradigmatic changes in how SAM and SAPIA are building advice. Science advice to European Commission is exactly as old as Commission itself. But there have been never three kinds of separation. Separation of advice from simply willingness to be important. So that's in more scientific words, we're now trying to avoid eminence-based advice. Second, which is well understood, SAM is trying to separate advice from lobbying. There are very powerful lobbying groups who attack the Commission all the time with piles of papers, and basically every lobbyist comes with reports in hands which exactly tells things what the lobbyist is wishing to say. And this thing is intrinsic also for eminent bodies like European Marine Board, to where I belong, and the European Polar Board. There is always a lobby inside. Some is trying to be without lobby. If we can keep this paradigmatic separation, there are good chances to be a winner. And third thing, which is not so clear, it's separation of voice of science from the voice of cash. It is a very subtle thing, but it's extremely important. It doesn't mean that scientists shouldn't be paid, but their voice should be separated from the voice of cash. There are other paradigmatic changes which science advisory mechanism is trying to bridge, actually. If you look how science was functioning in old science and how it's functioning today in science for industry, there was a very strong chain which was localized both in space and time. So there was somewhere was sitting a scientist, in next room there was inventor, next corridor was engineer, and next street was factory producing something. It's still there in industry, and scientists was paid and is paid industry from the profit earned from the goods which inventor and engineer made. In public science, there is now a very clear separation. There are many excellent scientists who are doing science and putting that somewhere which could be called either sea of knowledge, was told today by Evangelia, I believe, say it's multiverse of global knowledge. And there is another group of people much larger, inventors, engineers, entrepreneurs, they fish ideas from that pool. So the production and use of knowledge has completely changed. So the successful catches by engineers and entrepreneurs are converted into some products which are sold, and then public tax money is generated, from which science is funded. This sort of separation, even if it's quite inconvenient, we need to bridge that. And this sort of separation has actually very strong ramifications in many other parts of society. For example, in a family, the knowledge which we try to tell to our children or grandchildren, this doesn't function anymore. The children have access to this generic pool of knowledge, and we can't pre-select what they take from there. And if we try to educate people starting from primary school, like José was telling yesterday, it's far too late. And those things have come here to stay. We can't avoid them, we can ignore them, but they will work, they will change the society. And if you want to have a simple test of resilience, of trust between you and politicians. Tell them what the progress in IT sciences will do very soon. I mean, the societal effects of inventions like time-stamping and blockchain. Very soon, they make lying about the past impossible. And moreover, there is no need for trusted body like a ministry, bank or notarius. It's all done in your computer. Tell that to politicians and measure the reaction time in milliseconds.
We also alerted to the fact that it's very important to be aware of the fact that there are also other sources of advice to policy and not only science, and that this needs to be taken into consideration. We spoke about reliability, authority, transparency. We spoke about reward systems in several perspectives, be it monetary or that some work needs to be put into those. We spoke about impact and how impact can be traced, how impact can be achieved, how science advice can be effective. We spoke about communication and how communication needs to be done in terms of also uncertainty, in terms of risk, balancing of risks. We were reminded of the need to honestly assess what scientists, academies can do, cannot do. That we also have to make more efforts to include the best knowledge available in all respects. That the timing is important, and that issues are complex and need to be considered as being complex and not easy to solve. And I think this is something that is true for this whole aspect of science advice. As many people said, we are at the very beginning of this process, but we are definitely moving forward. We're gaining a lot of experience. This meeting today, I think, was very helpful. I thank you very much again. Now it's time for lunch. I'm not sure whether we will get food from the ocean, but we will for sure get something nice. And another very practical note for those of you who have to head to the airport today. Please be practical, leave not too late, and ideally you use the metro and do not rely on taxis. So with this very practical note, I would like to thank you again. Have a very nice day, stay in Bulgaria, enjoy the lunch and things like that.